Letters to the Family, 1907 onwards. Newspapers and Democracy. Let it be granted that, as the loud-voiced herald hired by the Eolithic tribe to cry the news of the coming day along the caves preceded the chosen tribal bard who sang the more picturesque history of the tribe, so is journalism senior to literature, in that journalism meets the first tribal need after warmth, food and women. In new countries it shows clear trace of its descent from the tribal herald. A tribe thinly occupying large spaces feels lonely. It desires to hear the roll call of its members cried often and loudly, to comfort itself with the knowledge that there are companions just below the horizon. It employs, therefore, heralds to name and describe all who pass. This is why newspapers of new countries seem often so outrageously personal. The tribe, moreover, needs quick and sure knowledge of everything that touches on its daily life in the big spaces, earth, air and water news, which the older peoples have put behind them. That is why its newspapers so often seem so laboriously trivial. For example, a red-nosed member of the tribe, Pete O'Halloran, comes in 30 miles to have his horse shod, and incidentally smashes the king bolt of his buckboard at a bad place in the road. The Tribal Herald, a thin weekly with a patent inside, connects the red nose and the breakdown with an innuendo which to the outsider is clumsy libel. But the Tribal Herald understands that 72 families of the tribe may use that road weekly. It concerns them to discover whether the accident was due to Pete being drunk, or, as Pete protests, to the neglected state of the road. 15 men happen to know that Pete's nose is an affliction, not an indication. One of them loafs across and explains to the Tribal Herald, who, next week, cries aloud that the road ought to be mended. Meantime, Pete, warmed to the marrow at having focused the attention of his tribe for a few moments, retires 30 miles upstage, pursued by advertisements of buckboards guaranteed not to break their king bolts. And later, which is what the tribe were after all the time, some tribal authority or other mends the road. This is only a big-scale diagram, but with a little attention you can see the tribal instinct of self-preservation quite logically underrunning all sorts of queer modern developments. As the tribe grows, and men do not behold the horizon from edge to unbroken edge, their desire to know all about the next man weakens a little, but not much. Outside the cities are still the long distances, the vast unoccupied areas of the advertisements, and the men who come and go yearn to keep touch with and report themselves as of old to their lodges. A man stepping out of the dark into the circle of the fires, naturally, if he be a true man, holds up his hands and says, "I, so-and-so, am here." You can watch the ritual in full swing at any hotel when the reporter, pro-Tribal Herald, runs his eyes down the list of arrivals, and before he can turn from the register is met by the newcomer, who, without special desire for notoriety, explains his business and intentions. Observe, it is always at evening that the reporter concerns himself with strangers. By day he follows the activities of his own city and the doings of nearby chiefs. But when it is time to close the stockade, to lager the wagons, to draw the thorn bush back into the gap, then in all lands he reverts to the Tribal Herald, who is also the tribal outer guard. There are countries where a man is indecently pawed over by chattering heralds who bob their foul torches in his face till he is singed and smoked at once. In Canada the necessary "stand and deliver your sentiments" goes through with the large decency that stamps all the Dominion. A stranger's words are passed on to the tribe quite accurately. No dirt is put into his mouth, and where the heralds judge that it would be better not to translate certain remarks, they courteously explain why. It was always delightful to meet the reporters, for they were men interested in their land with the keen, unselfish interest that one finds in young house surgeons or civilians. Thanks to the Boer War, many of them had reached out to the ends of our earth, and spoke of the sister nations as it did one good to hear. Consequently, the interviews, which are as dreary for the reporter as the reported, often turned into pleasant and unpublished talks. One felt at every turn of the quick sentences to be dealing with made and trained players of the game, balanced men who believed in decencies not to be disregarded, confidences not to be violated, and honour not to be mocked. This may explain what men and women have told me, that there is very little of the brutal domestic terrorism of the press in Canada, and not much blackmailing. They neither spat nor wriggled. They interpolated no juicy anecdotes of murder or theft among their acquaintance, and not once between either ocean did they or any other fellow subjects volunteer that their country was law-abiding. You know the first signpost of the great main road. When a woman advertises that she is virtuous, a man that he is a gentleman, a community that it is loyal, or a country that it is law-abiding, go the other way. Yet, while the men's talk was so good and new, their written word seemed to be cast in conventional, not to say old-fashioned, moulds. A quarter of a century ago, a sub-editor opening his mail could identify the Melbourne Argus, the Sydney Morning Herald, or the Cape Times as far as he could see them. Even unheaded clippings from them declared their origin, as a piece of hide betrays the beast that wore it. But he noticed then that Canadian journals left neither spore nor scent, might have blown in from anywhere between 30 degrees of latitude, and had to be carefully identified by hand. Today, the spacing, the headlines, the advertising of Canadian papers, the chessboard-like look of the open page, which should be a daily beautiful study in black and white, the brittle pulp paper, the machine-set type, are all as standardized as the railway cars of the continent. Indeed, looking through a mass of Canadian journals is like trying to find one's own sleeper in a corridor train. Newspaper offices are among the most conservative organizations in the world, but surely, after 25 years, some changes might be permitted to creep in, some original convention of expression or assembly might be developed. I drew up to this idea cautiously among a knot of fellow craftsmen. "You mean," said one straight-eyed youth, "that we are a back number copying back numbers?" It was precisely what I did mean, so I made haste to deny it. "We know that," he said cheerfully. "Remember, we haven't the sea all round us, and the postal rates to England have only just been lowered. It will all come right." Surely it will. But meantime, one hates to think of these splendid people using second-class words to express first-class emotions. And so, naturally, from journalism to democracy, every country is entitled to her reservations and pretences. But the more democratic a land is, the more make-believes must the stranger respect. Some of the tribal heralds were very good to me in this matter, and, as it were, nudged me when it was time to duck in the House of Rimmon. During their office hours, they professed an unflinching belief in the blessed word democracy, which means any crowd on the move. That is to say, the helpless thing which breaks through floors and falls into cellars, overturns pleasure boats by rushing from port to starboard, stamps men into pulp because it thinks it has lost sixpence, and jams and grills in the doorways of blazing theatres. Out of office, like everyone else, they relaxed. Many winked, a few were flippant, but they all agreed that the only drawback to democracy was demos, a jealous god of primitive tastes and despotic tendencies. I received a faithful portrait of him from a politician who had worshipped him all his life. It was practically the Epistle of Jeremy, the 6th chapter of Baruch, done into unquotable English. But Canada is not yet an ideal democracy. For one thing, she has had to work hard among rough-edged surroundings which carry inevitable consequences. For another, the law in Canada exists and is administered not as a surprise, a joke, a favour, a bribe, or a wrestling Turk exhibition, but as an integral part of the national character, no more to be forgotten or talked about than one's trousers. If you kill, you hang. If you steal, you go to jail. This has worked toward peace, self-respect, and, I think, the innate dignity of the people. On the other hand, which is where the trouble will begin, railways and steamers make it possible nowadays to bring in persons who need never lose touch of hot and cold water taps, spread tables, and crockery, till they are turned out, much surprised, into the wilderness. They clean miss the long weeks of salt water and the slow passage across the plains which pickled and tanned the early emigrants. They arrive with soft bodies and unaired souls. I had this vividly brought home to me by a man on a train among the Selkirks. He stood on the safety-railed rear platform, looked at the gigantic pine-furred shoulder round which men, at their lives' risk, had led every yard of the track, and chirped, "I say, why can't all this be nationalised?" There was nothing under heaven except the snows and the steep to prevent him from dropping off the cars and hunting a mine for himself, instead of which he went into the dining car. That is one type. A man told me the old tale of a crowd of Russian immigrants who, at a big fire in a city, verted to the ancestral type and blocked the streets, yelling, "Down with the Tsar!" That is another type. A few days later I was shown a wire stating that a community of Doukhobors, Russians again, had, not for the first time, undressed themselves and were fleeing up the track to meet the Messiah before the snow fell. Police were pursuing them with warm underclothing, and trains would please take care not to run over them. So there you have three sort of steam-born unfitness: soft, savage, and mad. There is a fourth brand, which may be either homegrown or imported, but democracies do not recognize it, of downright bad folk, grown healthy men and women who honestly rejoice in doing evil. These four classes acting together might conceivably produce a rather pernicious democracy: alien hysteria, blood craze, and the like, reinforcing local ignorance, sloth, and arrogance. For example, I read a letter in a paper sympathizing with these same Doukhobors. The writer knew a community of excellent people in England, you see where the rot starts, who lived barefoot, paid no taxes, ate nuts, and were above marriage. They were a soulful folk, living pure lives. The Doukhobors were also pure and soulful, entitled in a free country to live their own lives, and not to be oppressed, etc., etc. Imported soft, observe, playing up to imported mad. Meantime, disgusted police were chasing the Doukhobors into flannels, that they might live to produce children fit to consort with the sons of the man who wrote that letter, and the daughters of the crowd that lost their heads at the fire. All of which, men and women answered, we admit, but what can we do? We want people. And they showed vast and well-equipped schools, where the children of Slav immigrants are taught English and the songs of Canada. When they grow up, people said, you can't tell them from Canadians. It was a wonderful work. The teacher holds up pens, reels, and so forth, giving the name in English, the children repeating Chinese fashion. Presently, when they have enough words, they can bridge back to the knowledge they learned from their own country, so that a boy of 12, at say the end of a year, will produce a well-written English account of his journey from Russia, how much his mother paid for food by the way, and where his father got his first job. He will also lay his hand on his heart and say, I am a Canadian. This gratifies the Canadian, who naturally purrs over an emigrant, owing everything to the land which adopted him and set him on his feet. The Lady Bountiful of an English village takes the same interest in a child she has helped on in the world, and the child repays by his gratitude and good behaviour? Personally, one cannot care much for those who have renounced their own country. They may have had good reason, but they have broken the rules of the game, and ought to be penalised instead of adding to their score. Nor is it true, as men pretend, that a few full meals and fine clothes obliterate all taint of alien instinct and reversion. 1,000 years cannot be as yesterday for mankind, and one has only to glance at the races across the border to realise how in outlook, manner, expression and morale the South and South East profoundly and fatally affects the North and North West. That was why the sight of the beady-eyed, muddy-skinned, aproned women with handkerchiefs on their heads and oriental bundles in their hands always distressed one. "But why must you get this stuff?" I asked. "You know it's not your equal, and it knows that it's not your equal, and that's bad for you both. What is the matter with the English as immigrants?" The answers were explicit. Because the English do not work. Because we are sick of remittance men and loafers sent out here. Because the English are rotten with socialism. Because the English don't fit with our life. They kick at our way of doing things. They're always telling us how things are done in England. They carry frills. Don't you know the story of the Englishman who lost his way and was found half dead of thirst beside a river? When he was asked why he didn't drink, he said, "How the deuce can I without a glass?" But, I argued, over 3,000 miles of country, all these are excellent reasons for bringing in the Englishman. It's true that in his own country he is taught to shirk work, because kind, silly people fall over each other to help and debauch and amuse him. Here General January will stiffen him up. Remittance men are an affliction to every branch of the family, but your manners and morals can't be so tender as to suffer from a few thousand of them among your 6 millions. As to the Englishman's socialism, he is by nature the most unsocial animal alive. What you call socialism is his intellectual equivalent for Diabolo and Limerick competitions. As to his criticisms, you surely wouldn't marry a woman who agreed with you in everything, and you ought to choose your immigrants on the same lines. You admit that the Canadian is too busy to kick at anything. The Englishman is a born kicker. Yes, he is all that, they said. He kicks on principle, and that's what makes for civilization. So did your Englishman's instincts about the glass. Every new country needs, vitally needs, 0.5% of its population trained to die of thirst rather than drink out of their hands. You are always talking of the second generation of your Smyrniotes and Bessarabians. Think what the second generation of the English are. They thought, quite visibly, but they did not much seem to relish it. There was a queer string halt in their talk, a conversational shy across the road, when one touched on these subjects. After a while, I went to a tribal herald whom I could trust, and demanded of him point blank where the trouble really lay and who was behind it. "It is Labour," he said. "You had better leave it alone." End of Chapter 13. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Letters to the Family, 1907 onwards. Labour. From Letters of Travel by Rudyard Kipling. One cannot leave a thing alone if it is thrust under the nose at every turn. I had not quitted the Quebec steamer 3 minutes when I was asked point blank, "What do you think of the question of Asiatic exclusion which is agitating our community?" The second signpost on the great main road says, "If a community is agitated by a question, inquire politely after the health of the agitator." This I did without success, and had to temporize all across the continent till I could find someone to help me to acceptable answers. The question appears to be confined to British Columbia. There, after a while, the men who had their own reasons for not wishing to talk referred me to others who explained, and on the acutest understanding that no names were to be published. It is sweet to see engineers afraid of being hoisted by their own petards. One got more or less at something like facts. The Chinaman has always been in the habit of coming to British Columbia, where he makes, as he does elsewhere, the finest servant in the world. No one, I was assured on all hands, objects to the biddable Chinaman. He takes work which no white man in a new country will handle, and when kicked by the mean white, will not grossly retaliate. He has always paid for the privilege of making his fortune on this wonderful coast. But, with singular forethought and statesmanship, the popular will, some few years ago, decided to double the head tax on his entry. Strange as it may appear, the Chinaman now charges double for his services, and is scarce at that. This is said to be one of the reasons why overworked white women die or go off their heads, and why in new cities you can see blocks of flats being built to minimize the inconvenience of housekeeping without help. The birth rate will fall later in exact proportion to those flats. Since the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese have taken to coming over to British Columbia. They also do work which no white man will, such as hauling wet logs for lumber mills out of cold water at from 8 to 10 shillings a day. They supply the service in hotels and dining rooms and keep small shops. The trouble with them is that they are just a little too good, and, when attacked, defend themselves with asperity. A fair sprinkling of Punjabs, ex-soldiers, Sikhs, Musbis and Jats are coming in on the boats. The plague at home seems to have made them restless, but I could not gather why so many of them come from Shahpur, Pilur and Juldanur way. These men do not, of course, offer for house service, but work in the lumber mills, and with the least little care and attention could be made most valuable. Someone ought to tell them not to bring their old men with them, and better arrangements should be made for their remitting money home to their villages. They are not understood, of course, but they are not hated. The objection is all against the Japanese. So far, except that they are said to have captured the local fishing trade at Vancouver, precisely as the Malays control the Cape Town fish business, they have not yet competed with the whites. But I was earnestly assured by many men that there was danger of their lowering the standard of life and wages. The demand, therefore, in certain quarters is that they go, absolutely and unconditionally. You may have noticed that democracies are strong on the imperative mood. An attempt was made to shift them shortly before I came to Vancouver, but it was not very successful because the Japanese barricaded their quarters and flocked out, a broken bottle held by the neck in either hand, which they jabbed in the faces of the demonstrators. It is perhaps easier to haze and hammer bewildered Hindus and Tamils, as is being done across the border, than to stampede the men of the Yalu and the Liaoyang. Kipling notes these were battles in the Russo-Japanese War. But when one began to ask questions, one got lost in a maze of hints, reservations, and orations, mostly delivered with constraint, as though the talkers were saying a piece learned by heart. Here are some samples. A man penned me in a corner with a single heavily capitalized sentence. "There is a general sentiment among our people that the Japanese must go," said he. "Very good," said I. "How do you propose to set about it?" "That is nothing to us. There is a general sentiment," etc. "Quite so. Sentiment is a beautiful thing. But what are you going to do?" He did not condescend to particulars, but kept repeating the sentiment, which, as I promised, I record. Another man was a little more explicit. "We desire," he said, "to keep the Chinaman, but the Japanese must go." "Then who takes their place? Isn't this rather a new country to pitch people out of?" "We must develop our resources slowly, sir, with an eye to the interests of our children. We must preserve the continent for races which will assimilate with ours. We must not be swamped by aliens. Then bring in your own races, and bring 'em in quick, I ventured. This is the one remark one must not make in certain quarters of the West. I lost caste heavily when he explained, as exactly as the Dutch did at the Cape years ago, how British Columbia was by no means so rich as she appeared, that she was throttled by capitalists and monopolists of all kinds, that white labour had to be laid off and fed and warmed during the winter, that living expenses were enormously high, that they were at the end of a period of prosperity and were now entering on lean years, and that whatever steps were necessary for bringing in more white people should be taken with extreme caution. Then he added that the railway rates to British Columbia were so high that emigrants were debarred from coming on there. But haven't the rates been reduced? I asked. Yes, I believe they have. But immigrants are so much in demand that they are snapped up before they have got so far west. You must remember, too, that skilled labour is not like agricultural labour. It is dependent on so many considerations. And the Japanese must go. So people have told me. But I heard stories of dairies and fruit farms in British Columbia being thrown up because there was no labour to milk or pick the fruit. Is that true, do you think? Well, you can't expect a man with all the chances that our country offers him to milk cows in a pasture. A Chinaman can do that. We want races that will assimilate with ours, etc., etc. But didn't the Salvation Army offer to bring in 3,000 or 4,000 English some short time ago? And what came of that idea? It fell through. Why? For political reasons, I believe. We do not want people who will lower the standard of living. That's why the Japanese must go. Then why keep the Chinese? We can get on with the Chinese. We can't get on without the Chinese. But we must have emigration of a type that will assimilate with our people. I hope I have made myself clear. I hoped he had too. Now here a wife, a mother, and a housekeeper. We have to pay for this precious state of things with our health and our children's. Do you know the saying that the frontier is hard on women and cattle? This isn't the frontier, but in some respects it's worse, because we have all the luxuries and appearances, the pretty glass and silver to put on the table. We have to dust, polish, and arrange 'em after we've done our housework. I don't suppose that means anything to you, but try it for a month. We have no help. A Chinaman costs $50 or $60 a month now. Our husbands can't always afford that. How old would you take me for? I'm not 30. Well, thank God I stopped my sister coming out west. Oh, yes, it's a fine country. For men. Can't you import servants from England? I can't pay a girl's passage in order to have her married in 3 months. Besides, she wouldn't work. They won't when they see Chinamen working. Do you object to the Japanese too? Of course not. No one does. It's only politics. The wives of the men who earn $6 and $7 a day, skilled labour they call it, have Chinese and Jap servants. We can't afford it. We have to think of saving for the future. But those other people live up to every cent they earn. They know they're all right. They're labour. They'll be looked after, whatever happens. You can see how the state looks after me. A little later I had occasion to go through a great and beautiful city between 6 and 7 of a crisp morning. Milk and fish, vegetables, etc., were being delivered to the silent houses by Chinese and Japanese. Not a single white man was visible on that chilly job. Later still, a man came to see me, without too publicly giving his name. He was in a small way of business, and he told me, others had said much the same thing, that if I gave him away, his business would suffer. He talked for half an hour on end. Am I to understand, then, I said, that what you call labour absolutely dominates this part of the world? He nodded. That it is difficult to get skilled labour into here? Difficult? My God, if I want to get an extra hand for my business, I pay union wages, of course. I have to arrange to get him here secretly. I have to go out and meet him, accidental-like, down the line, and if the unions find out that he's coming, they, like as not, order him back east, or turn him down across the border. even if he has his union ticket. Why? They'll tell him that labour conditions are not good here. He knows what that means. He'll turn back quick enough. I'm in a small way of business, and I can't afford to take any chances fighting the unions. What would happen if you did? Do you know what's happening across the border? Men get blown up there with dynamite. But this isn't across the border. It's a damn sight too near to be pleasant, and witnesses get blown up too. You see, the labour situation ain't run from our side of the line. It's worked from down under. You may have noticed men were rather careful when they talked about it. Yes, I noticed all that. Well, it ain't a pleasant state of affairs. I don't say the unions here would do anything to you. And please understand, I'm all for the rights of labour myself. Labour has no better friend than me. I've been a working man, though I've got a business of my own now. Don't run away with any idea that I'm against labour, will you? Not the least. I can see that. You merely find that labour's a little bit, inconsiderate sometimes. Look at what happens across the border. I suppose they've told you that little fuss with the Japanese in Vancouver was worked from down under, haven't they? I don't think our own people would have done it by themselves. I've heard that several times. Is it quite sporting, do you think, to lay the blame on another country? You don't live here. But as I was saying, if we get rid of the Japs today, we'll be told to get rid of someone else tomorrow. There's no limit, sir, to what labour wants. None. I thought they only wanted a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. That may do for in the old country, but here they mean to boss the country. They do. And how does the country like it? We're about sick of it. It don't matter much in flush times. Employers'll do most anything sooner than stop work. But when we come to a pinch, you'll hear something. We're a rich land in spite of everything they make out, but we're held up at every turn by labour. Why, there's businesses on businesses which friends of mine, in a small way like myself, want to start. Businesses in every direction, if they was only allowed to start in. But they ain't. That's a pity. Now, what do you think about the Japanese question? I don't think, I know. Both political parties are playing up to the labour vote, if you understand what that means. I tried to understand. And neither side will tell the truth. That if the Asiatic goes, this side of the continent will drop out of sight, unless we get free white immigration. And any party that proposed white immigration on a large scale would be snowed under next election. I'm telling you what politicians think. Myself, I believe if a man stood up to labour, not that I've any feeling against labour, and just talks sense, a lot of people would follow him. Quietly, of course. I believe he could even get white immigration after a while. He'd lose the first election, of course, but in the long run, we're about sick of labour. I wanted you to know the truth. Thank you. And you don't think any attempt to bring in white immigration would succeed? Not if it didn't suit labour. You can try it if you like and see what happens. On that hint, I made an experiment in another city. There were 3 men of position and importance and affluence, each keenly interested in the development of their land, each asserting that what the land needed was white immigrants. And we 4 talked for 2 hours on the matter, up and down and in circles. The one point on which those 3 men were unanimous was that whatever steps were taken to bring people into British Columbia from England, by private recruiting or otherwise, should be taken secretly. Otherwise, the business of the people concerned in the scheme would suffer. At which point I dropped the great question of Asiatic exclusion which is agitating all our community, and I leave it to you, especially in Australia and the Cape, to draw your own conclusions. Externally, British Columbia appears to be the richest and loveliest section of the continent. Over and above her own resources, she has a fair chance to secure an immense Asiatic trade, which she urgently desires. Her land in many places over large areas is peculiarly fitted for the small farmer and fruit grower who can send his truck to the cities. On every hand I heard a demand for labour of all kinds. At the same time, in no other part of the continent did I meet so many men who so insistently decried the value and the possibilities of their country, or who dwelt more fluently on the hardships and privations to be endured by the white immigrant. I believe that one or two gentlemen have gone to England to explain the drawbacks viva voce. It is possible that they incur a great responsibility in the present, and even a terrible one for the future. End of Chapter 14. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Letters to the Family, 1907 onwards. The Fortunate Towns. From Letters of Travel by Rudyard Kipling. After politics, let us return to the prairie, which is the high veld, plus hope, activity, and reward. Winnipeg is the door to it, a great city in a great plain, comparing herself innocently enough to other cities of her acquaintance, but quite unlike any other city. When one meets in her own house a woman not seen since girlhood, she is all a stranger, till some remembered tone or gesture links up to the past, and one cries, "It is you, after all." But indeed the child has gone. The woman with her influences has taken her place. I tried vainly to recover the gawky, graceless city I had known, so unformed and so insistent on her shy self. I even ventured to remind a man of it. "I remember," he said, smiling, "but we were young then. This thing," indicating an immense perspective of asphalted avenue that dipped under 30 railway tracks, "only came up in the last 10 years, practically the last 5. We've had to enlarge all those warehouses yonder by adding 2 or 3 stories to 'em. And we've hardly begun to go ahead yet. We're just beginning." Warehouses, railway sidings, and such are only counters in the white man's game, which can be swept up and redealt as the play varies. It was the spirit in the thin, dancing air, the new spirit of the new city, which rejoiced me. Winnipeg has things in abundance, but has learned to put them beneath her feet, not on top of her mind, and so is older than many cities. None the less, the things had to be shown. For what shopping is to the woman, showing off his town is to the right-minded man. First came the suburbs, miles on miles of the dainty, clean outlined, wooden-built houses, where one can be so happy and so warm, each unjealously divided from its neighbour by the lightest of boundaries. One could date them by their architecture, year after year, back to the early 90s, which is when civilization began. Could guess within a few score dollars at their cost, and the incomes of their owners, and could ask questions about the new domestic appliances of today. "Asphalt streets and concrete sidewalks came up a few years ago," said our host as we trotted over miles of it. "We found it the only way to fight the prairie mud. Look." Where the daring road ended, there lay unsubdued, level with the pale asphalt, the tenacious prairie, over which civilization fought her hub-deep way to the west. And with asphalt and concrete they fight the prairie back every building season. Next came the show houses, built by rich men with an eye to the honour and glory of their city, which is the first obligation of wealth in a new land. We twisted and turned among broad, clean, tree-lined, sunlit boulevards and avenues, all sluiced down with an air that forbade any thought of fatigue, and talked of city government and municipal taxation, till in a certain silence we were shown a suburb of uncared-for houses, shops, and banks, whose sides and corners were rubbed greasy by the shoulders of loafers. Dirt and tin cans lay about the street. Yet it was not the squalor of poverty so much as the lack of instinct to keep clean. One race prefers to inhabit there. Next, a glimpse of a cold white cathedral, red brick schools almost as big, thank goodness, as some convents, hospitals, institutions, a mile or so of shops, and then a most familiar feeling lunch at a club, which would have amazed my Englishman at Montreal, where Men not yet old talked of Fort Garry as they remembered it, and tales of the founding of the city, of early administrative shifts and accidents, mingled with the younger men's prophecies and frivolities. There are a few places still left where men can handle big things with a light touch, and take more for granted in 5 minutes than an Englishman at home could puzzle out in a year. But one would not beat many English at lunch in a London club who took the contract for building London Wall, or helped bully King John into signing Magna Charta. I had 2 views of the city. One on a grey day from the roof of a monster building, whence it seemed to overflow and fill with noises the whole vast cup of the horizon, and still all round its edges jets of steam and the impatient cries of machinery showed it was eating out into the prairie like a smothered fire. The other picture was a silhouette of the city's flank, mysterious as a line of unexplored cliffs under a sky crimson barred from the zenith to the ground, where it lay, pale emerald behind the uneven ramparts. As our train halted in the last of the dusk and the rails glowed dull red, I caught the deep surge of it, 7 miles across the purple levels, saw the low, restless aurora of its lights. It is rather an awesome thing to listen to a vanguard of civilization talking to itself in the night in the same tone as a 1,000-year-old city. All the country hereabouts is riddled with railways for business and pleasure undreamed of 15 years ago, and it was a long time before we reached the clear prairie of air and space and open land. The air is different from any air that ever blew. The space is ampler than most spaces, because it runs back to the unhampered pole, and the open land keeps the secret of its magic as closely as the sea or the desert. People here do not stumble against each other round corners, but see largely and tranquilly from a long way off what they desire or wish to avoid, and they shape their path accordingly across the waves and troughs and tongues and dips and fans of the land. When mere space and the stoop of the high sky begin to overwhelm, earth provides little ponds and lakes lying in soft-flanked hollows, where people can step down out of the floods of air and delight themselves with small and known distances. Most of the women I saw about the houses were down in the hollows, and most of the men were on the crests and the flats. Once, while we halted, a woman drove straight down at us from the skyline, along a golden path between black-ploughed lands. When the horse, who managed affairs, stopped at the cars, she nodded mysteriously and showed us a very small baby in the hollow of her arm. Doubtless she was some exiled queen flying north to found a dynasty and establish a country. The prairie makes everything wonderful. They were threshing wheat on both sides or the track as far as the eye could see. The smoke of the machines went up in orderly perspective alongside the mounds of chaff. Thus a machine, a house, a mound of chaff, a stretch of wheat in stocks, and then repeat the pattern over the next few degrees of longitude. We ran through strings of nearly touching little towns, where I remembered an occasional shack, and through big towns once represented by a name board, a siding, and 2 troopers of the North West Police. In those days, men proved that wheat would not grow north of some fool's line or other, or if it did, that no one would grow it. Now the wheat was marching with us as far as the eye could reach. The railways were out, 200-300 miles north, peopling a new wheat country, and north of that again the Grand Trunk was laying down a suburban extension of a few thousand miles across the continent, with branches perhaps to Dawson City, certainly to Hudson Bay. "Come north and look," cried the Afrites of the railway. "You're only on the fringe of it here." I preferred to keep to the old road and to gape at miracles accomplished since my day. The old false-fronted, hollow-stomached Western hotels were gone, their places filled by 5-story brick or stone ones, with post offices to match. Occasionally some overlooked fragment of the past still cleaved to a town and marked it for an old acquaintance, but often one had to get a mile away and look back on a place, as one holds a palimpsest up against the light, to identify the long overlaid lines of the beginnings. Each town supplied the big farming country behind it, and each town carried the Union Jack on a flagstaff in its playground. So far as one could understand, the scholars are taught neither to hate nor despise nor beg from their own country. I whispered to a man that I was a little tired of 3 days' tyranny of wheat, besides being shocked at farmers who used clean bright straw for fuel and made bonfires of their chaff hills. "You're way behind the times," said he. "There's fruit and dairying and any quantity of mixed farming going forward all around, let alone irrigation further west. Wheat's not our only king by a long sight. Wait till you strike such and such a place." It was there I met a prophet and a preacher in the shape of a commissioner of the local board of trade (all towns have them), who firmly showed me the vegetables which his district produced. They were vegetables too, all neatly staged in a little kiosk near the station. I think the pious Thomas Tusser would have loved that man. "Providence," said he, shedding pamphlets at every gesture, "did not intend everlasting wheat in this section. No, sir. Our business is to keep ahead of Providence, to meet her with mixed farming. Are you interested in mixed farming? Pshaw! Too bad you missed our fruit and vegetable show. It draws people together, mixed farming does. I don't say wheat is narrowing to the outlook, but I claim there's more sociability and money in mixed farming. We've been hypnotized by wheat and cattle. Now, the cars won't start yet awhile. I'll just tell you my ideas." For 15 glorious minutes he gave me condensed essence of mixed farming, with excursions into sugar beet. Did you know they're making sugar in Alberta? And he talked of farmyard muck, our dark mother of all things, with proper devotion. "What we want now," he cried in farewell, "is men, more men. Yes, and women." They need women sorely for domestic help, to meet the mad rush of work at harvest time, maids who will help in house, dairy, and chicken run till they are married. A steady tide sets that way already, one contented settler recruiting others from England. But if 1/10 of that energy wasted on social reform could be diverted to decently thought out and supervised emigration work, Labour does not yet object to people working on the land, we might do something worth talking about. The races which work and do not form committees are going into the country at least as fast as ours. It makes one jealous and afraid to watch aliens taking honestly so much of this treasure of good fortune and sane living. There was a town down the road which I had first heard discussed nigh 20 years ago by a broken down prospector in a box car. "Young feller," said he, after he'd made a professional prophecy, "you'll hear of that town if you live. She's born lucky." I saw the town later. It was a siding by a trestle bridge where Indians sold beadwork, and as years passed I gathered that the old tramp's prophecy had come true, and that luck of some kind had struck the little town by the big river. So this trip I stopped to make sure. It was a beautiful town of 6,000 people, and a railway junction beside a high girdered iron bridge. There was a public garden with trees at the station. A company of joyous men and women, whom that air and that light and their own goodwill made our brothers and sisters, came along in motors and gave us such a day as never was. "What about the luck?" I asked. "Heavens," said one, "haven't you heard about our natural gas? The greatest natural gas in the world. Oh, come and see." I was whirled off to a roundhouse full of engines and machinery shops, worked by natural gas, which comes out of the earth, smelling slightly of fried onions, at a pressure of 600 pounds, and by valves and taps is reduced to 4 pounds. There was luck enough to make a metropolis. Imagine a city's heating and light, to say nothing of power, laid on at no greater expense than that of piping. "Are there any limits to the possibilities of it?" I demanded. "Who knows? We're only at the beginning. We'll show you a brick-making plant out on the prairie run by gas. But just now we want to show you one of our pet farms." Away swooped the motors like swallows, over roads any width you please, and up to what looked like the high veldt itself. A major of the mounted police, who had done a year at the Boer War, told us how the ostrich farm fencing and the little meerkats sitting up and racing about South Africa had made him homesick for the sight of the gophers by the wayside. and the endless panel of wire fencing along which we rushed. The prairie has nothing to learn from the veldt about fencing or tricky gates. "After all," said the Major, "there's no country to touch this. I've had 30 years of it, from one end to the other." Then they pointed out all the quarters of the horizon, say 50 miles wherever you turned, and gave them names. The show farmer had taken his folk to church, but we friendly slipped through his gates and reached the silent spick and span house with its trim barn, and a vast mound of copper-coloured wheat piled in the sun between two mounds of golden chaff. Everyone thumbed a sample of it and passed judgment. It must have been worth a few hundred golden sovereigns as it lay out on the veldt, and we sat around on the farm machinery, and in the hush that a shut-up house always imposes, we seemed to hear the lavish earth getting ready for new harvests. There was no true wind, but a push, as it were, of the whole crystal atmosphere. "Now for the brickfield!" they cried. It was many miles off. The road fed by a never-to-be-forgotten drop to the river broad as the Orange at Norval's Point, rustling between mud hills. An old Scotsman in the very likeness of Charon, with big hip boots, controlled a pontoon, which sagged back and forth by the current on a wire rope. The reckless motors bumped on to this ferry through a foot of water, and Charon, who never relaxed, bore us statelily across the dark, broad river to the further bank, where we all turned to look at the lucky little town and discuss its possibilities. "I think you can see it best from here," said one. "No, from here," said another, and their voices softened on the very name of it. Then for an hour we raced over true prairie, great yellow-green plains crossed by old buffalo trails which do not improve motor springs, till a single chimney broke the horizon like a mast at sea, and thereby were more light-hearted men and women, a shed and a tent or two for workmen, the ribs and frames of the brick-making mechanism, a 15-foot square shaft sunk 60 foot down to the clay, and, stark and black, the pipe of a natural gas well. The rest was prairie, the mere curve of the earth, with little grey birds calling. I thought it could not have been simpler, more audacious or more impressive, till I saw some women in pretty frocks go up and peer at the hissing gas valves. "We fancied that it might amuse you," said all those merry people, and between laughter and digressions they talked over projects for building, first their own and next other cities, in brick of all sorts, giving figures of output and expenses of plant that made one gasp. To the eye the affair was no more than a novel or delicious picnic. What it actually meant was a committee to change the material of civilization for 100 miles around. I felt as though I were assisting at the planning of Nineveh, and whatever good comes to the little town that was born lucky, I shall always claim a share. But there's no space to tell how we fed, with a prairie appetite, in the men's quarters, on a meal prepared by an artist; how we raced home at speeds no child could ever hear of, and no grown-up should attempt; how the motors squattered at the ford and took pot-shots at the pontoon till even Sharon smiled; how great horses hauled the motors up the gravelly bank into the town; how there we met people in their Sunday best, walking and driving, and pulled ourselves together and looked virtuous; and how the merry company suddenly and quietly evanished, because they thought that their guests might be tired. I can give you no notion of the pure, irresponsible frolic of it, of the almost affectionate kindness, the gay and inventive hospitality that so delicately controlled the whole affair, any more than I can describe a certain quiet half hour in the dusk just before we left, when the company gathered to say good-bye, while young couples walked in the street, and the glare of the never-extinguished natural gas lamps coloured the leaves of the trees a stage green. It was a woman speaking out of the shadow who said what we all felt. "You see, we just love our town." "So do we," I said, and it slid behind us. End of Chapter 15. The Fortunate Towns. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Letters to the Family, 1907 onwards. Mountains and the Pacific. The prairie proper ends at Calgary, among the cattle ranches, mills, breweries, and 3-million-acre irrigation works. The river that floats timber to the town from the mountains does not slide nor rustle like prairie rivers, but brawls across bars of blue pebbles, and a greenish tinge in its water hints of the snows. What I saw of Calgary was crowded into one lively half hour. Motors were invented to run about new cities. What I heard I picked up, oddly enough, weeks later from a young Dane in the North Sea. He was qualmish, but his saga of triumph upheld him. 3 years ago I come to Canada by steerage, 3rd class, and I have the language to learn. Look at me. I have now my own dairy business in Calgary, and look at me, my own half section, that is 320 acres, all my land which is mine. And now I come home, 1st class, for Christmas here in Denmark, and I shall take out back with me some friends of mine which are farmers, to farm on those irrigated lands near by Calgary. Oh, I tell you, there is nothing wrong with Canada for a man which works. And will your friends go? I inquired. You bet they will. It's all arranged already. I bet they get ready to go now already, and in 3 years they will come back for Christmas here in Denmark, 1st class, like me. Then you think Calgary is going ahead? You bet. We are only at the beginning of things. Look at me. Chickens. I raise chickens also in Calgary, etc., etc. After all this pageant of unrelieved material prosperity, it was a rest to get to the stillness of the big foothills, though they too had been inspanned for the work of civilization. The timber off their sides was ducking and pitch-poling down their swift streams, to be sawn into house stuff for all the world. The woodwork of a purely English villa may come from as many imperial sources as its owner's income. The train crept, whistling to keep its heart up through the winding gateways of the hills, till it presented itself very humbly before the true mountains, the not-so-little brothers to the Himalayas. Mountains of the pine-cloaked, snow-capped breed are unchristian things. Men mine into the flanks of some of them, and trust to modern science to pull them through. Not long ago a mountain kneeled on a little mining village as an angry elephant kneels, but it did not get up again, and the half of that camp was no more seen on earth. The other half still stands, uninhabited. The heathen in his blindness would have made arrangements with the genius of the place before he ever drove a pick there. As a learned scholar of a little-known university once observed to an engineer officer on the Himalaya-Tibet road, "You white men gain nothing by not noticing what you cannot see. You fall off the road, or the road falls on you, and you die, and you think it all an accident. How much wiser it was when we were allowed to sacrifice a man officially, sir, before making bridges or other public works. Then the local gods were officially recognized, sir, and did not give any more trouble, and the local workmen, sir, were much pleased with these precautions." There are many local gods on the road through the Rockies, old bald mountains that have parted with every shred of verdure and stand wrapped in sheets of wrinkled silver rock, over which the sight travels slowly as in delirium. Mad, horned mountains wreathed with dancing mists. Low-browed and bent-shouldered fakirs of the wayside, sitting in meditation beneath a burden of glacier ice that thickens every year. And mountains of fair aspect on one side, but on the other seamed with hollow, sunless clefts, where last year's snow is blackened with this year's dirt and smoke of forest fires. The drip from it seeps away through the slopes of unstable gravel and dirt, till at the appointed season the whole half-mile of undermined talus slips and roars into the horrified valley. The railway winds in and out among them with little inexplicable deviations and side twists, much as a buck walks through a forest glade, sidling and crossing uneasily in what appears to be a plain way. Only when the track has rounded another shoulder or two, a backward and upward glance at some menacing slope shows why the train did not take the easier-looking road on the other side of the gorge. From time to time the mountains lean apart and nurse between them some golden valley of slow streams, fat pastures, and park-like uplands, with a little town and cowbells tinkling among berry bushes, and children who have never seen the sun rise or set shouting at the trains, and real gardens round the houses. At Calgary it was a frost, and the dahlias were dead. A day later nasturtiums bloomed untouched beside the station platforms, and the air was heavy and liquid with the breath of the Pacific. One felt the spirit of the land change with the changing outline of the hills, till, on the lower levels by the Fraser, it seemed that even the Sussex Downs must be nearer at heart to the prairie than British Columbia. The prairie people notice the difference, and the hill people, unwisely, I think, insist on it. Perhaps the magic may lie in the scent of strange evergreens and mosses not known outside the ranges, or it may strike from wall to wall of timeless rifts and gorges. But it seemed to me to draw out of the great sea that washes further Asia, the Asia of allied mountains, mines, and forests. We rested one day high up in the Rockies to visit a lake carved out of pure jade, whose property is to colour every reflection on its bosom to its own tint. A belt of brown dead timber on a gravel scar showed upside down like sombre cypresses rising from green turf, and the reflected snows were pale green. In summer many tourists go there, but we saw nothing except the wonder-working lake lying mute in its circle of forest, where red and orange lichens grew among grey and blue moss, and we heard nothing except the noise of its outfall hurrying through a jam of bone-white logs. The thing might have belonged to Tibet or some unexplored valley behind Kinchinjunga. It had no concern with the West. As we drove along the narrow hill road, a piebald pack pony with a china blue eye came round a bend, followed by two women, black-haired, bare-headed, wearing beadwork squaw jackets and riding straddle. A string of pack ponies trotted through the pines behind them. "Indians on the move," said I. "How characteristic." As the women jolted by, one of them very slightly turned her eyes, and they were, past any doubt, the comprehending equal eyes of the civilized white woman which moved in that berry-brown face. "Yes," said our driver, when the cavalcade had navigated the next curve. "That'll be Mrs. So-and-so and Miss So-and-so. They mostly camp hereabouts for 3 months every year. I reckon they're coming into the railroad before the snow falls." "And whereabouts do they go?" I asked. "Oh, all about anywheres. If you mean where they come from just now, that's the trail yonder." He pointed to a hair crack across the face of a mountain, and I took his word for it that it was a safe pony trail. The same evening, at an hotel of all the luxuries, a slight woman in a very pretty evening frock was turning over photographs, and the eyes beneath the strictly arranged hair were the eyes of the woman in the beadwork jacket who had quirted the piebald pack pony past our buggy. Praised be Allah for the diversity of His creatures. But do you know any other country where two women could go out for a 3 months' trek and shoot in perfect comfort and safety? These mountains are only 10 days from London, and people more and more use them for pleasure grounds. Other and most unthought of persons buy little fruit farms in British Columbia as an excuse for a yearly visit to the beautiful land, and they tempt yet more people from England. This is apart from the regular tide of immigration, and serves to make the land known. If you asked a state-owned railway to gamble on the chance of drawing tourists, the Commissioner of Railways would prove to you that the experiment could never succeed, and that it was wrong to risk the taxpayers' money in erecting first-class hotels. Yet South Africa could even now be made a tourist's place if only the railroads and steamship lines had faith. Thinking things over, I suspect that I was not intended to appreciate the merits of British Columbia too highly. Maybe I misjudged, maybe she was purposely misrepresented, but I seemed to hear more about problems and crises and situations in her borders than anywhere else. So far as the eye or ear could gather, the one urgent problem was to find enough men and women to do the work in hand. Lumber, coal, minerals, fisheries, fit soil for fruit, dairy and poultry farms are all there in a superb climate. The natural beauty of earth and sky match these lavish gifts, to which are added thousands of miles of safe and sheltered waterways for coastal trade, deep harbours that need no dredge, the groundworks of immense and ice-free ports, all the title deeds to half the trade of Asia. For the people's pleasure and good, disport salmon, trout, quail, and pheasant play in front of and through the suburbs of her capitals. A little axe work and road metalling gives a city one of the loveliest water-girt parks that we have outside the tropics. Another town is presented with 100 islands, knolls, wooded coves, stretches of beach, and dingles, laid down as expressly for camp life, picnics, and boating parties, beneath skies never too hot and rarely too cold. If they care to lift up their eyes from their almost subtropical gardens, they can behold snowy peaks across blue bays, which must be good for the soul. Though they face a sea out of which any portent may arise, they are not forced to protect or even to police its waters. They are as ignorant of drought, moraine, pestilence, locust, and blight as they are of the true meaning of want and fear. Such a land is good for an energetic man. It is also not so bad for the loafer. I was, as I have told you, instructed on its drawbacks. I was to understand that there was no certainty in any employment, and that a man who earned immense wages for 6 months of the year would have to be kept by the community if he fell out of work for the other 6. I was not to be deceived by golden pictures set before me by interested parties, that is to say, by almost everyone I met, and I was to give due weight to the difficulties and discouragements that beset the intending immigrant. Were I an intending immigrant, I would risk a good deal of discomfort to get on to the land in British Columbia, and were I rich, with no attachments outside England, I would swiftly buy me a farm or a house in that country for the mere joy of it. I forgot those doleful and unhumorous conspirators among people who fervently believed in the place, but afterwards the memory left a bad taste in my mouth. Cities, like women, cannot be too careful what sort of men they allow to talk about them. Time had changed Vancouver, literally out of all knowledge. From the station to the suburbs and back to the wharves, every step was strange, and where I remembered open spaces and still untouched timber, the tramcars were fleeting people out to a lacrosse game. Vancouver is an aged city, for only a few days previous to my arrival the Vancouver baby, i.e. the first child born in Vancouver, had been married. A steamer, once familiar in Table Bay, had landed a few hundred Sikhs and Punjabi Jats, to each man his bundle, and the little groups walked uneasy alone, keeping, for many of them had been soldiers, to the military step. Yes, they said, they had come to this country to get work. News had reached their villages that work at great wages was to be had in this country. Their brethren who had gone before had sent them the news. Yes, and sometimes the money for the passage out. The money would be paid back from the so great wages to come. With interest? Assuredly with interest. Did men lend money for nothing in any country? They were waiting for their brethren to come and show them where to eat, and later how to work. Meanwhile, this was a new country. How could they say anything about it? No, it was not like Gurgaon, or Shahpur, or Jullundur. The sickness, plague, had come to all these places. It had come into the Punjab by every road, and many, many, many had died. The crops, too, had failed in some districts. Hearing the news about these so great wages, they had taken ship for the belly's sake, for the money's sake, for the children's sake. Would they go back again? They grinned as they nudged each other. The Sahib had not quite understood. They had come over for the sake of the money, the rupees, no, the dollars. The Punjab was their home, where their villages lay, where their people were waiting. Without doubt, they would go back. Then came the brethren, already working in the mills, cosmopolitans, dressed in ready-made clothes and smoking cigarettes. "This way, O you people!" they cried. The bundles were reshouldered and the turbaned knots melted away. The last words I caught were true Sikh talk. But what about the money, O my brother? Some Punjabis have found out that the money can be too dearly bought. There was a Sikh in a sawmill, had been driver in a mountain battery at home. Himself he was from Amritsar. Oh, pleasant as cold water in a thirsty land is the sound of a familiar name in a fair country. But you had your pension. Why did you come here? Heaven born. Because my sense was little. And there was also the sickness at Amritsar. The historian, 100 years hence, will be able to write a book on economic changes brought about by pestilence. There is a very interesting study somewhere of the social and commercial effects of the Black Death in England. On a wharf, waiting for a steamer, some 30 Sikhs, many of them wearing their old uniforms, which should not be allowed, were talking at the top of their voices, so that the shed rang like an Indian railway station. A suggestion that if they spoke lower, life would be easier, was instantly adopted. Then a senior officer with a British India medal asked hopefully, "Has the Sahib any orders where we are to go?" Alas, he had none. Nothing but goodwill and greetings for these sons of Khalsa as they tramped off in fours. It is said that when a little riot broke out in Vancouver, these heathen were invited by other Asiatics to join in defending themselves against the white man. They refused on the ground that they were subjects of the king. I wonder what tales they sent back to their villages, and where and how fully every detail of the affair was talked over. White men forget that no part of the empire can live or die to itself. Here is a rather comic illustration of this on the material side. The wonderful waters between Vancouver and Victoria are full of whales, leaping and rejoicing in the strong blue all about the steamer. There is, therefore, a whalery on an island near by, and I had the luck to travel with one of the shareholders. "Whales are beautiful beasts," he said affectionately. "We've a contract with a Scotch firm for every barrel of oil we can deliver for years ahead. It's reckoned the best for harness dressing." He went on to tell me how a swift ship goes hunting whales with a bomb gun and explodes shells into their insides so that they perish at once. "Or the old harpoon and boat business would take till the cows come home. We kill 'em right off." "And how do you strip 'em?" It seemed that the expeditious ship carried also a large air pump and pumped up the carcass to float roundly till she could attend to it. At the end of her day's kill she would return, towing sometimes as many as 4 inflated whales to the whalery, which is a factory full of modern appliances. The whales are hauled up inclined planes like logs to a sawmill, and as much of them as will not make oil for the Scotch leather dresser or cannot be dried for the Japanese market is converted into potent manure. "No manure can touch ours," said the shareholder. "It's so rich in bone, you see. The only thing that has beat us up to date is their hides. But we've fixed up a patent process now for turning 'em into floor cloth. Yes, they're beautiful beasts. That fellow," he pointed to a black hump in a wreath of spray, "would cut up a miracle." "If you go on like this, you won't have any whales left," I said. "That's so. But the concern pays 30%, and a few years back no one believed in it." I forgave him everything for the last sentence. End of Mountains and the Pacific. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Of BigBible.org. Letters to the Family, 1907. A Conclusion. From Letters of Travel by Rudyard Kipling. Canada possesses 2 pillars of strength and beauty in Quebec and Victoria. The former ranks by herself among those mother cities of whom none can say, "This reminds me." To realize Victoria, you must take all that the eye admires most in Bournemouth, Torquay, the Isle of Wight, the Happy Valley at Hong Kong, the Doon, Sorrento, and Camps Bay, and add reminiscences of the Thousand Islands. Arrange the whole around the Bay of Naples, with some Himalayas for the background. Real estate agents recommend it as a little piece of England. The island on which it stands is about the size of Great Britain, but no England is set in any such seas or so fully charged with the mystery of the larger ocean beyond. The high, still twilights along the beaches are out of the old East, just under the curve of the world. And even in October the sun rises warm from the first. Earth, sky and water wait outside every man's door to drag him out to play if he looks up from his work. And though some other cities in the Dominion do not quite understand this immoral mood of nature, men who have made their money in them go off to Victoria, and, with the zeal of converts, preach and preserve its beauties. We went to look at a marine junk store, which had once been Eskimo, a station of the British Navy. It was reached through winding roads, lovelier than English lanes, along watersides and parkways, any one of which would have made the fortune of a town. Most cities, a man said suddenly, lay out their roads at right angles. We do in the business quarters. What do you think? I fancy some of those big cities will have to spend millions on curved roads some day for the sake of a change, I said. You've got what no money can buy. That's what men tell us who come to live in Victoria, and they've had experience. It is pleasant to think of the Western millionaire, hot from some gridiron of rectangular civilization, confirming good Victorians in the policy of changing vistas and restful curves. There is a view when the morning mists peel off the harbour where the steamers tie up, or the Houses of Parliament on one hand and a huge hotel on the other, which, as an example of cunningly fitted in waterfronts and facades, is worth a very long journey. The hotel was just being finished. The ladies' drawing room, perhaps 100 feet by 40, carried an arched and superbly enriched plaster ceiling of knobs and arabesques and interlacings, which somehow seemed familiar. We saw a photo of it in Country Life, the contractor explained. It seemed just what the room needed. So one of our plasterers, a Frenchman, that's him, took and copied it. It comes in all right, doesn't it? About the time the noble original was put up in England, Drake might have been sailing somewhere off this very coast. So you see, Victoria lawfully holds the copyright. I tried honestly to render something of the colour, the gaiety and the graciousness of the town and the island, but only found myself piling up unbelievable adjectives, and so let it go with 100 other wonders and repented that I had wasted my time and yours on the anxious-eyed gentleman who talked of drawbacks. A verse cut out of a newspaper seems to sum up their attitude. As the land of little leisure is the place where things are done, so the land of scanty pleasure is the place for lots of fun. In the land of plenty trouble, people laugh as people should, but there's someone always kicking in the land of heap too good. At every step of my journey, people assured me that I had seen nothing of Canada. Silent mining men from the north, fruit farmers from the Okanagan Valley, foremen of railway gangs, not so long from English public schools, the oldest inhabitant of the town of Villeneuve, aged 28, certain English who lived on the prairie and contrived to get fun and good fellowship as well as money, the single-minded wheat growers and cattlemen, election agents, police troopers expansive in the dusk of wayside halts, officials dependent on the popular will who talked as delicately as they walked, and queer souls who did not speak English and said so loudly in the dining car, each in his or her own way, gave me to understand this. My excursion bore the same relation to their country as a bus ride down the Strand bears to London, so I knew how they felt. The excuse is that our own flesh and blood are more interesting than anybody else, and I held by birth the same right in them and their lives as they held in any other part of the Empire. Because they had become a people within the Empire, my right was admitted and no word spoken, which would not have been the case a few years ago. One may mistake many signs on the road, but there is no mistaking the spirit of sane and realised nationality which fills the land from end to end, precisely as the joyous hum of a big dynamo, well settled to its load, makes a background to all other shop noises. For many reasons, that spirit came late, But since it has come after the day of little things, doubts, and open or veiled contempts, there is less danger that it will go astray among the boundless wealth and luxury that await it. The people, the schools, the churches, the press in its degree, and above all the women, understand without manifestos that their land must now, as always, abide under the law in deed and in word and in thought. This is their caste mark, the ark of their covenant, their reason for being what they are. In the big cities, with their village-like lists of police and court offences, in the wide-open little western towns, where the present is as free as the lives, and the future as safe as the property of their inhabitants. In the coast cities, galled and humiliated at their one night's riot. It's not our habit, sir, it's not our habit. Up among the mountains, where the officers of the law track and carefully bring into justice the astounded malefactor. And behind the orderly prairies to the barren grounds, as far as a single white man can walk, the relentless spirit of the breed follows up and oversees and controls. It does not much express itself in words, but sometimes in intimate discussion one is privileged to catch a glimpse of the inner fires. They burn hotly. "We do not mean to be decivilized," said the first man with whom I talked about it. That was the answer throughout, the keynote and the explanation. Otherwise, the Canadians are as human as the rest of us to evade or deny a plain issue. The duty of developing their country is always present, but when it comes to taking thought, better thought, for her defence, they refuge behind loose words and childish anticipations of miracles, quite in the best imperial manner. All admit that Canada is wealthy, few that she is weak, still fewer that unsupported she would very soon cease to exist as a nation. The anxious inquirer is told that she does her duty towards England by developing her resources, that wages are so high that a paid army is out of the question, that she is really maturing splendid defence schemes but must not be hurried or dictated to, that a little wise diplomacy is all that will ever be needed in this so civilized era, that when the evil day comes something will happen. It certainly will. The whole concluding very often with a fervent essay on the immorality of war, all about as much to the point as carrying a dove through the streets to allay pestilence. The question before Canada is not what she thinks or pays, but what an enemy may think it necessary to make her pay. If she continues wealthy and remains weak, she will surely be attacked under one pretext or another. Then she will go under, and her spirit will return to the dust with her flag as it slides down the halyards. That is absurd, is always the quick answer. In her own interests, England could never permit it. What you speak of presupposes the fall of England. Not necessarily. Nothing worse than a stumble by the way. But when England stumbles, the empire shakes. Canada's weakness is lack of men. England's weakness is an excess of voters who propose to live at the expense of the state. These loudly resent that any money should be diverted from themselves, and since money is spent on fleets and armies to protect the empire while it is consolidating, they argue that if the empire ceased to exist, armaments would cease too, and the money so saved could be spent on their creature comforts. They pride themselves on being an avowed and organised enemy of the empire, which, as others see it, waits only to give them health, prosperity, and power beyond anything their votes could win them in England. But their leaders need their votes in England, as they need their outcries and discomforts to help them in their municipal and parliamentary careers. No engineer lowers steam in his own boilers. So they are told little except evil of the great heritage outside, and are kept compounded in cities under promise of free rations and amusements. If the empire were threatened, they would not, in their own interests, urge England to spend men and money on it. Consequently, it might be well if the nations within the empire were strong enough to endure a little battering unaided at the first outset, till such time, that is, as England were permitted to move to their help. For this end, an influx of good men is needed, more urgently every year during which peace holds, men loyal, clean and experienced in citizenship, with women not ignorant of sacrifice. Here the gentlemen who propose to be kept by their neighbours are our helpful allies. They have succeeded in making uneasy the class immediately above them, which is the English working class, as yet undebauched by the temptation of state-aided idleness or state-guaranteed irresponsibility. England has millions of such silent, careful folk, accustomed even yet to providing for their own offspring, to bring them up in a resolute fear of God, and to desire no more than the reward of their own labours. A few years ago this class would not have cared to shift. Now they feel the general disquiet. They live close to it. Tea and sugar borrowing friends have told them jocularly, or with threats, of a good time coming when things will go hard with the uncheerful giver. The prospect appeals neither to their reason nor their savings bank books. They hear, they do not need to read, the speeches delivered in their streets on a Sunday morning. It is one of their preoccupations to send their children to Sunday school by roundabout roads, lest they should pick up abominable blasphemies. When the tills of the little shops are raided, or the family ne'er-do-well levies on his women with more than usual brutality, they know, because they suffer, what principles are being put into practice. If these people could quietly be shown a quiet way out of it all, very many of them would call in their savings, they are richer than they look, and slip quietly away. In the English country, as well as in the towns, there is a feeling, not yet panic, but the dull edge of it, that the future will be none too rosy for such as are working, or are in the habit of working. This is all to our advantage. Canada can best serve her own interests and those of the Empire by systematically exploiting this new recruiting ground. Now that South Africa, with the exception of Rhodesia, has been paralysed, and Australia has not yet learned the things which belong to her peace, Canada has the chance of the century to attract good men and capital into the Dominion. But the men are much more important than the money. They may not at first be as clever with the hoe as the Bessarabian or the Bokhariot, or whatever the fashionable breed is, but they have qualities of pluck, good humour, and a certain well-wearing virtue which are not altogether bad. They will not hold aloof from the life of the land, nor pray in unknown tongues to Byzantine saints, while the very tenacity and caution which made them cleave to England this long help them to root deeply elsewhere. They are more likely to bring their women than other classes, and those women will make sacred and individual homes. A little regarded Crown colony has a proverb that no district can be called settled till there are pots of musk in the house windows, a sure sign that an English family has come to stay. It is not certain how much of the present steamer-dumped foreign population has any such idea. We have seen a financial panic in one country send a whole army corps of aliens kiting back to the lands whose allegiance they forswore. What would they or their likes do in time of real stress, since no instinct in their bodies or their souls would call them to stand by till the storm were over? Surely the conclusion of the whole matter throughout the whole empire must be men and women of our own stock, habits, language, and hopes, brought in by every possible means under a well-settled policy. Time will not be allowed us to multiply to unquestionable peace, but by drawing upon England we can swiftly transfuse what we need of her strength into her veins, and by that operation bleed her into health and sanity. Meantime, the only serious enemy to the empire, within or without, is that very democracy which depends on the empire for its proper comforts, and in whose behalf these things are urged. End of the conclusion. End of Letters to the Family, 1907 onwards. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Of the Magicians, 1913 onwards. Sea Travel. From Letters of Travel by Rudyard Kipling. I had left Europe for no reason except to discover the sun, and there were rumours that he was to be found in Egypt. But I had not realised what more I should find there. A P&O boat carried us out of Marseilles. A serang of Lascars with whistle, chain, shawl, and fluttering blue clothes was at work on the baggage hatch. Somebody bungled at the winch. The serang called him a name unlovely in itself, but awakening delightful memories in the hearer. "Oh, serang, is that man a fool?" "Very foolish, Sahib. He comes from Surat. He only comes for his food's sake." The serang grinned. The Surtee man grinned. The winch began again, and the voices that called, "Lower away! Stop her!" were as familiar as the friendly whiff from the Lascar's galley or the slap of bare feet along the deck. But for the passage of a few impertinent years, I should have gone without hesitation to share their rice. Serangs used to be very kind to little white children below the age of caste. Most familiar of all was the ship itself. It had slipped my memory, nor was there anything in the rates charged to remind me that single screws still lingered in the gilt-edged passenger trade. Some North Atlantic passengers accustomed to real ships made the discovery, and were as pleased about it as American tourists at Stratford-on-Avon. "Oh, come and see!" they cried. "She has one screw, only one screw. Hear her thump! And have you seen their old barn of a saloon? And the officers' library. It's open for 2 half-hours a day, weekdays, and 1 on Sundays. You pay $1.25 deposit on each book. We wouldn't have missed this trip for anything. It's like sailing with Columbus." They wandered about, voluble, amazed, and happy, for they were getting off at Port Said. I explored too. From the rough iron table linen, the thick tooth glasses for the drinks, the slummocky set out of victuals at meals, to the unaccommodating regulations in the curtainless cabin, where they had not yet arrived at bunk-edge trays for morning tea, time and progress had stood still with the P&O. To be just, there were electric fan fittings in the cabins, but the fans were charged extra, and there was a rumour, unverified, that one could eat on deck or in one's cabin without a medical certificate from the doctor. All the rest was under the old motto, "Quis separabit." This is quite separate from other lines. "After all," said an Anglo-Indian whom I was telling about civilized ocean travel, "they don't want you Egyptian trippers. They're sure of us because—" and he gave me many strong reasons connected with leave, finance, the absence of competition, and the ownership of the Bombay foreshore. "But it's absurd," I insisted. "The whole concern is out of date. There's a notice on my deck forbidding smoking and the use of naked lights, and there's a Lascar messing about the hold hatch outside my cabin with a candle in a lantern." Meantime, our one-screw tub thumped gingerly towards Port Said. Because we had no mails aboard, and the Mediterranean, exhausted after severe February hysterics, lay out like oil. I had some talk with a Scotch quartermaster, who complained that the Lascars are not what they used to be, owing to their habit (but it's existed since the beginning) of signing on as a clan or family, all sorts together. The serang said that for his part he had noticed no difference in 20 years. "Men are always of many kinds, Sahib, and that is because God makes men this and that. Not all one pattern. Not by any means all one pattern." He told me, too, that wages were rising, but the price of ghee, rice, and curry stuffs was up too, which was bad for wives and families at Porbandar. And that also is thus, and no talk makes it otherwise. After Suez he would have blossomed into thin clothes and long talks, but the bitter spring chill nipped him, as the thought of partings just accomplished and work just ahead chilled the Anglo-Indian contingent. Little by little, one came at the outlines of the old stories. A sick wife left behind here, a boy there, a daughter at school, a very small daughter trusted to friends or hirelings, certain separation for so many years, and no great hope or delight in the future. It was not a nice India that the tales hinted at. Here is one that explains a great deal. There was a Pathan, a Mohammedan, in a Hindu village, employed by the village moneylender as a debt collector, which is not a popular trade. He lived alone among Hindus, and, so ran the charge in the lower court, he wilfully broke the caste of a Hindu villager by forcing on him forbidden Mussulman food. And when that pious villager would have taken him before the headman to make reparation, the godless one drew his Afghan knife and killed the headman, besides wounding a few others. The evidence ran without flaw, as smoothly as well-arranged cases should, and the Pathan was condemned to death for wilful murder. He appealed, and by some arrangement or other got leave to state his case personally to the Court of Revision. Said, I believe, that he did not much trust lawyers, but that if the sahibs would give him a hearing, as man to man, he might have a run for his money. Out of the jail then he came, and, Pathan-like, not content with his own good facts, must needs begin by some fairy tale that he was a secret agent of the government sent down to spy on that village. Then he warmed to it. Yes, he was that moneylender's agent, a persuader of the reluctant, if you like, working for a Hindu employer. Naturally, many men owed him grudges. A lot of the evidence against him was quite true, but the prosecution had twisted it abominably. About that knife, for instance. True, he had a knife in his hand exactly as they had alleged. But why? Because with that very knife he was cutting up and distributing a roast sheep which he had given as a feast to the villagers. At that feast, he sitting in amity with all his world, the village rose up at the word of command, laid hands on him, and dragged him off to the headman's house. How could he have broken any man's caste when they were all eating his sheep? And in the courtyard of the headman's house they surrounded him with heavy sticks and worked themselves into anger against him, each man exciting his neighbour. He was a Pathan. He knew what that sort of talk meant. A man cannot collect debts without making enemies. So he warned them. Again and again he warned them, saying, "Leave me alone. Do not lay hands on me." But the trouble grew worse, and he saw it was intended that he should be clubbed to death like a jackal in a drain. Then he said, "If blows are struck, I strike, and I strike to kill because I am a Pathan." But blows were struck, heavy ones. Therefore, with the very Afghan knife that had cut up the mutton, he struck the headman. "Had you meant to kill the headman?" "Assuredly. I am a Pathan. When I strike to kill. I had warned them again and again. I think I got him in the liver. He died. And that is all there is to it, sahibs. It was my life or theirs. They would have taken mine over my freely given meats. Now, what'll you do with me?" In the long run, he got several years for culpable homicide. But, said I, when the tale had been told, whatever made the lower court accept all that village evidence? It was too good on the face of it. The lower court said it could not believe it possible that so many respectable native gentlemen could have banded themselves together to tell a lie. Oh, had the lower court been long in the country? It was a native judge, was the reply. If you think this over in all its bearings, you will see that the lower court was absolutely sincere. Was not the lower court itself a product of Western civilization, and as such bound to play up, to pretend to think along Western lines, translating each grade of Indian village society into its English equivalent, and ruling as an English judge would have ruled? Pathans, and incidentally English officials, must look after themselves. There is a fell disease of this century called snobbery of the soul. Its germ has been virulently developed in modern cultures from the uncomplex bacillus isolated 60 years ago by the late William Makepeace Thackeray. Precisely as Major Ponto, with his plated dishes and stable boy masquerading as footman, lied to himself and his guests so. But the Book of Snobs can only be brought up to date by him who wrote it. Then a man struck in from the Sudan, far and far to the south, with a story of a discomposed judge and a much too collected prisoner. To the great bazaars of Omdurman, where all things are sold, came a young man from the uttermost deserts of somewhere or other, and heard a gramophone. Life was of no value to him till he had bought the creature. He took it back to his village, and at twilight set it going among his ravished friends. His father, Sheikh of the village, came also, listened to the loud shoutings without breath, the strong music lacking musicians, and said, justly enough, "This thing is a devil. You must not bring devils into my village. Lock it up." They waited until he had gone away, and then began another tune. A second time the Sheikh came, repeated the command, and added that if the singing box was heard again, he would slay the buyer. But their curiosity and joy defied even this, and for the third time, late at night, they slipped in pin and record and let the jinn rave. So the Sheikh, with his rifle, shot his son as he had promised, and the English judge before whom he eventually came had all the trouble in the world to save that earnest grey head from the gallows. Thus: "Now, old man, you must say guilty or not guilty." "But I shot him. That is why I am here. I—" "Hush. It is a form of words which the law asks. Sotto voce. Write down that the old idiot doesn't understand." "Be still now." "But I shot him. What else could I have done? He bought a devil in a box, and—" "Quiet. That comes later. Leave talking." "But I am Sheikh of the village. One must not bring devils into a village. I said I would shoot him." "This matter is in the hands of the law. I judge." "What need? I shot him."
Suppose that your son had brought a devil in a box to your village. They explained to him at last that under British rule
fathers must hand over devil-dealing children to be shot by the white men, the first step, you see, on the downward path of state aid, and that he must go to prison for several months for interfering with a government shoot. We are a great race. There was a pious young judge in Nigeria once who kept a condemned prisoner waiting very many minutes while he hunted through the Hausa dictionary word by word for "May God have mercy on your soul." And I heard another tale about the Suez Canal this time, a hint of what may happen some day at Panama. There was a tramp steamer loaded with high explosives on her way to the east, and at the far end of the canal one of the sailors very naturally upset a lamp in the forecastle. After a heated interval, the crew took to the desert alongside, while the captain and the mate opened all cocks and sank her, not in the fairway but up against a bank, just leaving room for a steamer to squeeze past. Then the canal authorities wired to her charterers
to know exactly what there might be in her,
and it was said that the reply kept them awake of nights, for it was their business to blow her up. Meantime, traffic had to go through, and a P&O steamer came along. There was the canal, there was the sunken wreck, marked by one elderly Arab in a little boat with a red flag,
and there was about 5 foot clearance on each side for the P&O.
She went through a tiptoe because even 50 tons of dynamite will jar a boat perceptibly, and the tramp held more, very much more, not to mention detonators. By some absurd chance, almost the only passenger who knew about the thing at the time was an old lady rather proud of the secret. "Ah," she said, in the middle of that agonized glide, "you may depend upon it that if everybody knew what I know, they'd all be on the other side of the ship." Later on, the authorities blew up the tramp with infinite precautions from some 2 miles off, for which reason she neither destroyed the Suez Canal nor dislocated the Sweetwater Canal alongside, but merely dug out a hole 100 feet or 100 yards deep, and so vanished from Lloyd's register. But no stories could divert one long from the peculiarities of that amazing line which exists strictly for itself. There was a bathroom occupied at the windy end of an open alleyway. In due time the bather came out.
said the steward as he swabbed out the tub for his successor. "That was the chief engineer. He's been some time. Must have had a mucky job below this morning." I have great admiration for chief engineers. They are men in authority, needing all the comforts and aids that can possibly be given them, such as bathrooms of their own, close to their own cabins, where they can clean off at leisure. It is not fair to mix them up with the ruck of passengers, nor is it done on real ships. Nor, when a passenger wants a bath in the evening, do the stewards of real ships roll their eyes like vergers in a cathedral and say, "We'll see if it can be managed." They double down the alleyway and shout, "Match 'em!" or "Ponting!" or "Guds 'em!" And in 15 seconds one of those swift three has the taps going and the towels out. Real ships are not annexes of Westminster Abbey or Borstal Reformatory. They supply decent accommodation in return for good money, and I imagine that their directors instruct their staffs to look pleased while at work. Some generations back there must have been an idea that the P&O was vastly superior to all lines afloat, a sort of semi-pontifical show not to be criticised. How much of the notion was due to its own excellence, and how much to its passenger traffic monopoly, does not matter. Today it neither feeds nor tends its passengers, nor keeps its ships well enough to put on any airs at all. For which reason, human nature being what it is, it surrounds itself with an ungracious atmosphere of absurd ritual to cover grudged and inadequate performance. What it really needs is to be dropped into a March North Atlantic, without any lascars, and made to swim for its life between a CPR boat and a North German Lloyd, till it learns to smile. End of Chapter 18. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Egypt of the Magicians, 1913 onwards. A Return to the East. From Letters of Travel by Rudyard Kipling. The East is a much larger slice of the world than Europeans care to admit. Some say it begins at St. Gothard, where the smells of two continents meet and fight all through that terrible restaurant car dinner in the tunnel. Others have found it at Venice on warm April mornings. But the East is wherever one sees the lateen sail, that shark's fin of a rig which for hundreds of years has dogged all white bathers round the Mediterranean. There is still a suggestion of menace, a hint of piracy in the blood wherever the lateen goes by, fishing or fruiting or coasting. "This is not my ancestral trade," she whispers to the accomplice sea. "If everybody had their rights, I should be doing something quite different. For my father, he was the junk, and my mother, she was the dhow, and between the two of 'em they made Asia." Then she tacks, disorderly but deadly quick, and shuffles past the unimaginative steam packet with her hat over one eye and the knife, as it were, up her baggy sleeves. Even the stone boats at Port Said, busied on jetty extensions, show their untamed descent beneath their loaded clumsiness. They are all children of the camel-nosed dhow, who is the mother of mischief. But it was very good to meet them again in raw sunshine, unchanged in any rope and patch. Old Port Said had disappeared beneath the acres of new buildings, where one could walk at leisure without being turned back by soldiers. 2 or 3 landmarks remained. 2 or 3 were reported as still in existence, and one face showed itself after many years, ravaged but respectable, rigidly respectable. "Yes," said the face, "I have been here all the time, but I have made money, and when I die I am going home to be buried." "Why do you not go home before you are buried, O face?" "Because I've lived here so long. Home is only good to be buried in." "And what do you do nowadays?" "Nothing now. I live on my rentes, my income." Think of it. to live icily in perpetual cinematograph show of excited, uneasy travellers, to watch huge steamers sliding in and out all day and all night like railway trucks, unknowing and unsought by a single soul aboard, to talk 5 or 6 tongues indifferently, but to have no country, no interest in any earth, except one reservation in a continental cemetery. It was a cold evening, after heavy rain, and the half-flooded streets reeked. But we undefeated tourists ran about in droves and saw all that could be seen before train time. We missed, most of us, the Canal Company's garden, which happens to mark a certain dreadful and exact division between East and West. Up to that point, it is a fringe of palms stiff against the sky. The impetus of home memories and the echo of home interests carry the young man along very comfortably on his first journey. But at Suez one must face things. People, generally the most sympathetic, leave the boat there. The older men who are going on have discovered each other and begun to talk shop. No newspapers come aboard, only clipped Reuter telegrams. The world seems cruelly large and self-absorbed. One goes for a walk and finds this little bit of kempt ground, with comfortable garden-gated houses on either side of the path. Then one begins to wonder, in the twilight for choice, when one will see those palms again from the other side. Then the black hour of homesickness, vain regrets, foolish promises, and weak despair, shuts down with the smell of strange earth and the cadence of strange tongues. Crossroads and halting places in the desert are always favoured by jinns and afrits. The young man will find them waiting for him in the Canal Company's garden at Port Said. On the other hand, if he is fortunate enough to have won the East by inheritance, as there are families who served her for 5 or 6 generations, he will meet no ghouls in that garden, but a free and friendly and an ample welcome from good spirits of the East that awaits him. The voices of the gardeners and the watchmen will be as the greetings of his father's servants in his father's house. The evening smells and the sight of the hibiscus and poinsettia will unlock his tongue in words and sentences that he thought he had clean forgotten, and he will go back to the ship, I have seen, as a prince entering on his kingdom. There was a man in our company, a young Englishman, who had just been granted his heart's desire in the shape of some raw district south of everything southerly in the Sudan, where, on 2/3 of a Member of Parliament's wage, under conditions of life that would horrify a self-respecting operative, he will see perhaps some dozen white men in a year, and will certainly pick up 2 sorts of fever. He had been moved to work very hard for this billet by the representations of a friend in the same service, who said that it was a rather decent sort of service, and that he was all of a heat to reach Khartoum, report for duty, and fall to. If he is lucky, he may get a district where the people are so virtuous that they do not know how to wear any clothes at all, and so ignorant that they have never yet come across strong drink. The train that took us to Cairo was own sister in looks and fittings to any South African train, for which I loved her. But she was a trial to some citizens of the United States, who, being used to the Pullman, did not understand the side-corridored, solid compartment idea. The trouble with a standardized democracy seems to be that, once they break loose from their standards, they have no props. People are not left behind, and luggage is rarely mislaid on the railroads of the older world. There is an ordained ritual for the handling of all things, to which, if a man will only conform and keep quiet, he and his will be attended to with the rest. The people that I watched would not believe this. They charged about futilely, and wasted themselves in trying to get ahead of their neighbours. Here is a fragment from the restaurant car. "Look at here! Me and some friends of mine are going to dine at this table. We don't want to be separated, and you have your number for the service, sir?" "Number? What number? We want to dine here, I tell you." "You shall get your number, sir, for the first service." "How's that? Where in thunder do we get the numbers anyway?" "I will give you the number, sir, at the time. 4 places at the first service. Yes, but we want to dine together here, right now. The service is not yet ready, sir. And so on, and so on, with marchings and counter-marchings, and every word nervously italicised. In the end, they dined precisely where there was room for them in that new world which they had strayed into. On one side our windows looked out on darkness of the waste, on the other at the black canal, all spaced with monstrous headlights of the night-running steamers. Then came towns lighted with electricity, governed by mixed commissions and dealing in cotton. Such a town, for instance, as Zagazig, last seen by a very small boy who was lifted out of a railway carriage and set down beneath a whitewashed wall under naked stars in an illimitable emptiness, because, they told him, the train was on fire. Childlike, this did not worry him. What stuck in his sleepy mind was the absurd name of the place, and his father's prophecy that when he grew up he would come that way in a big steamer. So all his life the word Zagazig carried memories of a brick shed, the flicker of an oil lamp's floating wick, a sky full of eyes, and an engine coughing in the desert at the world's end, which memories returned in a restaurant car jolting through what seemed to be miles of brilliantly lighted streets and factories. No one at the table had even turned his head for the battlefields of Kassassin and Tel el Kebir. After all, why should they? That work is done, and children are getting ready to be born who will say, I can remember Gondokoro, or El Obeid, or some undreamed of Clapham Junction, Abyssinia way, before a single factory was started, before the overhead traffic began. Yes, when there was a fever, actually fever, in the city itself. The gap is no greater than that between today's and t'other day's Zagazig, between the horsed vans of the overland route in Lieutenant Waghorn's time and the shining motor that flashed us to our Cairo hotel through what looked like the suburbs of Marseille or Rome. Always keep a new city till morning. In the daytime, as it is written in the perspicuous book, thou hast long occupation. Our window gave on to the river, but before one moved toward it, one heard the thrilling squeal of the kites, those same thievish companions of the road, who at that hour were watching every Englishman's breakfast in every compound and camp from Cairo to Calcutta. Voices rose from below, unintelligible words in maddeningly familiar accents. A black boy in one blue garment climbed, using his toes as fingers, the tipped mainyard of a Nile boat and framed himself in the window. Then, because he felt happy, he sang, all among the wheeling kites, and beneath our balcony rolled the very Nile himself, golden in sunshine, wrinkled under strong breezes, with a crowd of creaking cargo boats waiting for a bridge to be opened. On the cut-stone quay above, a line of cab drivers, a tikkagari stand, nothing less, lolled and chafed and tinkered with their harnesses in every beautiful attitude of the ungirt East. All the ground about was spotted with chewed sugar cane, first sign of the hot weather all the world over. Troops with startlingly pink faces, one would not have noticed this yesterday, rolled over the girder bridge between churning motors and bubbling camels, and the whole long-coated, loose-sleeved Muslim world was awake and about its business, as befits sensible people who pray at dawn. I made haste to cross the bridge and hear the palms in the wind on the far side. They sang as nobly as though they had been true coconuts, and the thrust of the north wind behind them was almost as open-handed as the thrust of the trades. Then came a funeral, the sheeted corpse on a shallow cot. The brisk-paced bearers, if he was good, the sooner he is buried, the sooner in heaven. If bad, bury him swiftly for the sake of the household. Either way, as the prophet says, do not let the mourners go too long weeping and hungry. The women behind, tossing their arms and lamenting, and men and boys chanting low and high. They might have come forth from Taksali Gate in the city of Lahore on just such a cold weather morning as this, on their way to the Mohammedan burial grounds by the river, and the veiled countrywomen shuffling side by side, elbow pressed to hip, and eloquent right hand pivoting round, palm uppermost, to give value to each shrill phrase, might have been the wives of so many Punjabi cultivators, but that they wore another type of bangle and slipper. A knotty-kneed youth, sitting high on a donkey, both amuleted against the evil eye, chewed 3 purplish feet of sugar cane, which made one envious as well as voluptuously homesick, though the sugar cane of Egypt is not to be compared with that of Bombay. Hans Breitmann writes somewhere, "Oh, if you live in Leyden town, you'll meet, if truth be told, der forms of all der Freunds dot tied, when du wirst 6 years old." And they were all there, under the chanting palms. Syces, orderlies, peddlers, water carriers, street cleaners, chicken sellers, and slate-coloured buffalo, with china blue eyes, being talked to by a little girl with a big stick. Behind the hedges of well-kept gardens squatted the brown gardener, making trenches indifferently with a hoe or a toe, and under the municipal lamp-post lounged the bronze policeman, a touch of Arab about the mouth and lean nostril, quite unconcerned with a ferocious row between 2 donkey men. They were fighting across the body of a Nubian who had chosen to sleep in that place. Presently one of them stepped back on the sleeper's stomach. The Nubian grunted, elbowed himself up, rolled his eyes, and pronounced a few utterly dispassionate words. The warriors stopped, settled their headgear, and went away as quickly as the Nubian went to sleep again. This was life, the real, unpolluted stuff, worth a desertful of mummies. And right through the middle of it, hooting and kicking up the Nile, passed a Cook's steamer, all ready to take tourists to Aswan. From the Nubian's point of view, she, and not himself, was the wonder, as great as the Swiss-controlled, Swiss-staffed hotel behind her, whose lift maybe the Nubian helped to run. Marids and Afrits, guardians of hidden gold, who choke or crush the rash seeker, encounters with the long-buried dead in a Cairo back alley, undreamed-of promotions, and suddenly lit loves are the stuff of any respectable person's daily life. But the white man from across the water, arriving in hundreds with his unveiled womenfolk, who builds himself flying rooms and talks along wires, who flees up and down the river, mad to sit upon camels and asses, constrained to throw down silver from both hands, at once a child and a warlock. This thing must come to the Nubian sheer out of the 1001 Nights. At any rate, the Nubian was perfectly sane. Having eaten, he slept in God's own sunlight, and I left him to visit the fortunate and guarded and desirable city of Cairo, to whose people, male and female, Allah has given subtlety in abundance. Their jesters are known to have surpassed in refinement the jesters of Damascus, as did their 12 police captains in the hardiest and most corrupt Baghdad in the tolerant days of Harun al-Rashid, while their old women, not to mention their young wives, could deceive the father of lies himself. Delhi is a great place. Most bizarre storytellers in India make their villain hail from there. But when the agony and intrigue are piled highest, and the tale halts till the very last breathless sprinkle of cowries has ceased to fall on his mat, why then, with wagging head and hooked forefinger, the storyteller goes on. But there was a man from Cairo, an Egyptian of the Egyptians, who... And all the crowd knows that a bit of real metropolitan devilry is coming. End of chapter 19. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Egypt of the Magicians, 1913 onwards. A Serpent of the Old Nile. From Letters of Travel by Rudyard Kipling. Modern Cairo is an unkempt place. The streets are dirty and ill-constructed, the pavements unswept and often broken, the tramways thrown rather than laid down, the gutters neglected. One expects better than this in a city where the tourist spends so much of every season. Granted that the tourist is a dog, he comes at least with a bone in his mouth, and a bone that many people pick. He should have a cleaner kennel. The official answer is that the tourist traffic is a flea bite compared with the cotton industry. Even so, land in Cairo city must be too valuable to be used for cotton growing. It might just as well be paved or swept. There is some sort of authority supposed to be in charge of municipal matters, but its work is crippled by what is called the capitulations. It was told to me that everyone in Cairo except the English, who appear to be the mean whites of these parts, has the privilege of appealing to his consul on every conceivable subject, from the disposal of a garbage can to that of a corpse. And almost everyone with claims to respectability, and certainly everyone without any, keeps a consul. It follows that there is one consul per superficial metre, ashin or cubit of Ezekiel within the city, and since every consul is zealous for the honour of his country and not at all above annoying the English on general principles, municipal progress is slow. Cairo strikes one as unventilated and unsterilised, even when the sun and wind are scouring it together. The tourist talks a good deal, as you may see here, but the permanent European resident does not open his mouth more than is necessary. Sound travels so far across flat water. Besides, the whole position of things, politically and administratively, is essentially false. Here is a country which is not a country, but a longish strip of market garden, nominally in charge of a government which is not a government, but a disconnected satrapy of a half-dead empire, controlled peck-sniffingly by a power which is not a power but an agency, which agency has been tied up by years, custom and blackmail into all sorts of intimate relations with 6 or 7 European powers, all with rights and perquisites, none of whose subjects seem directly amenable to any power which at first, second or third hand is supposed to be responsible. That is the barest outline. To fill in the details, if any living man knows them, would be as easy as to explain baseball to an Englishman or the Eton Wall game to a citizen of the United States. But it is a fascinating play. There are Frenchmen in it, whose logical mind it offends, and they revenge themselves by printing the finance reports and the catalogue of the Bullock Museum in pure French. There are Germans in it, whose demands must be carefully weighed. Not that they can by any means be satisfied, but they serve to block other people's. There are Russians in it, who do not very much matter at present, but will be heard from later. There are Italians and Greeks in it, both rather pleased with themselves just now, full of the higher finance and the finer emotions. There are Egyptian pashas in it, who come back from Paris at intervals and ask plaintively to whom they are supposed to belong. There is His Highness the Khedive in it, and he must be considered not a little. And there are women in it, up to their eyes. And there are great English cotton and sugar interests, and angry English importers clamouring to know why they cannot do business on rational lines or get into the Sudan, which they hold is ripe for development if the administration there would only see reason. Among these conflicting interests and amusements sits and perspires the English official, whose job is irrigating or draining or reclaiming land on behalf of a trifle of 10 million people, and he finds himself tripped up by skeins of intrigue and bafflement which may ramify through half a dozen harems and 4 consulates. All this makes for suavity, toleration, and the blessed habit of not being surprised at anything whatever. Or so it seemed to me, watching a big dance at one of the hotels. Every European race and breed and half of the United States were represented, but I fancied I could make out 3 distinct groupings: the tourist,
with the steamer trunk creases still across their dear excited backs, the military and officials, sure of their partners beforehand and saying clearly what ought to be said, and a third contingent, lower voiced, softer footed, and keener eyed than the other two, at ease as gypsies are on their own ground, flinging half words in local argot over their shoulders at their friends, and understanding on the nod, and moved by springs common to their clan only. For example, a woman was talking flawless English with her partner, an English officer. Just before the next dance began, another woman beckoned to her Eastern fashion, with all four fingers flicking downward. The first woman crossed to a potted palm. The second moved toward it also, till the two drew up, not looking at each other, the plant between them. Then she who had beckoned spoke in a strange tongue at the palm. The first woman, still looking away, answered in the same fashion with a rush of words that rattled like buckshot through the stiff fronds. Her tone had nothing to do with that in which she greeted her new partner, who came up as the music began. The one was a delicious drawl. The other had been a guttural rasp and click of the kitchen and the bazaar. So she moved off, and in a little the second woman disappeared into the crowd. Most likely it was no more than some question of the programme or dress, but the prompt feline stealth and coolness of it, the lightning-quick return to and from world-apart civilizations, stuck in my memory. So did the bloodless face of a very old Turk, fresh from some horror assassination in Constantinople, in which he too had been nearly pistolled. But, they said, he had argued quietly over the body of a late colleague as one to whom death was of no moment, until the hysterical young Turks were abashed and let him get away, to the lights and music of this elegantly appointed hotel. These modern Arabian Nights are too hectic for quiet folk. I declined a more rational Cairo, the Arab city where everything is as it was when Maruf the cobbler fled from Fatima el Ora and met the jinn of the Adalia Musjid. The craftsmen and merchants sat on their shop boards, a rich mystery of darkness behind them, and narrow gullies were polished to shoulder height by the mere flux of people. Shod white men, unless they are agriculturists, touch lightly with their hands at most in passing. Easterns lean and loll and squat and sidle against things as they daunder along. When the feet are bare, the whole body thinks. Moreover, it is unseemly to buy or to do aught and to be done with it. Only people with tight-fitting clothes that need no attention have time for that. So we of the loose skirt and flowing trousers and slack slipper make full and ample salutations to our friends, and redouble them toward our ill-wishers. And if it be a question of purchase, the stuff must be fingered and appraised with a proverb or so. And if it be a fool tourist who thinks he cannot be cheated, oh, true believers, draw near and witness how we shall loot him. But I bought nothing. The city thrust more treasure upon me than I could carry away. It came out of dark alleyways on tawny camels loaded with pots, on pattering asses half buried under nets of cut clover, in the exquisitely modelled hands of little children scurrying home from the cook shop with the evening meal, chin pressed against the platter's edge and eyes round with responsibility above the pile, in the broken lights from jutting rooms overhead where women lie, chin between palms, looking out of windows not a foot from the floor, in every glimpse into every courtyard where the men smoke by the tank, in the heaps of rubbish and rotten bricks that flank newly painted houses waiting to be built some day into houses once more, in the slap and slide of the heelless red and yellow slippers all around, and above all in the mixed delicious smells of frying butter, Mohammedan bread, kebabs, leather, cooking smoke, asafoetida, peppers and turmeric. Devils cannot abide the smell of burning turmeric, but the right-minded man loves it. It stands for evening that brings all home, the evening meal, the dipping of friendly hands in the dish, the one face, the drop veil, and a big guttering pipe afterwards. Praised be Allah for the diversity of his creatures, and for the 5 advantages of travel, and for the glories of the cities of the earth. Harun al-Rashid, in roaring Baghdad of old, never delighted himself to the limits of such a delight as was mine that afternoon. It's true that the call to prayer, the cadence of some street cries, and the cut of some of the garments differed a little from what I had been brought up to, but for the rest, the shadow of the dial had turned back 20 degrees for me, and I found myself saying, as perhaps the dead say when they have recovered their wits, "This is my real world again." Some men are Mohammedan by birth, some by training, and some by fate, but I have never met an Englishman yet who hated Islam and its people as I have met Englishmen who hated some other faiths. Musalmani awadani, as the saying goes. Where there are Mohammedans, there is a comprehensible civilization. Then we came upon a deserted mosque of pitted brick colonnades round a vast courtyard open to the pale sky. It was utterly empty, except for its own proper spirit, and that caught one by the throat as one entered. Christian churches may compromise with images and side chapels where the unworthy or abashed can traffic with accessible saints. Islam has but one pulpit and one stark affirmation, living or dying, one only. And where men have repeated that in red-hot belief through centuries, the air still shakes to it. Now, some say that Islam is dying and that nobody cares. Others that if she withers in Europe and Asia, she will renew herself in Africa and will return, terrible after certain years, at the head of all the 9 sons of Ham. Others dream that the English understand Islam as no one else does, and in years to be, Islam will admit this and the world will be changed. If you go to the Mosque Al-Azhar, the 1,000-year-old University of Cairo, you will be able to decide for yourself. There is nothing to see except many courts, cool in hot weather, surrounded by cliff-like brick walls. Men come and go through dark doorways, giving on to yet darker cloisters, as freely as though the place was a bazaar. There are no aggressive educational appliances. The students sit on the ground, and their teachers instruct them, mostly by word of mouth, in grammar, syntax, logic, al-hisab, which is arithmetic, al-jaba wa al-mukabala, which is algebra, at-tafsir, commentaries on the Quran, and, last and most troublesome, al-hadith, traditions, and yet more commentaries on the law of Islam, which leads back, like everything, to the Quran once again. For it is written, truly the Quran is none other than a revelation. It is a very comprehensive curriculum. No man can master it entirely, but any can stay there as long as he pleases. The university provides commons, 25,000 loaves a day, I believe, and there is always a place to lie down in for such as do not desire a shut room and a bed. Nothing could be more simple, or, given certain conditions, more effective. Close upon 600 professors, who represent officially or unofficially every school of thought, teach 10 or 12,000 students, who draw from every Mohammedan community, west and east between Manila and Morocco, north and south between Kamchatka and the Malay Mosque at Cape Town. These drift off to become teachers of little schools, preachers at mosques, students of the law known to millions, but rarely to Europeans, dreamers, devotees, or miracle workers in the ends of the earth. The man who interested me most was a red-bearded, sunk-eyed mullah from the Indian frontier, not likely to be last at any distribution of food, who stood up like a lean wolfhound among collies in a little assembly at a doorway. And there was another mosque, sumptuously carpeted and lighted, which the Prophet does not approve of, where men prayed in the dull mutter that at times mounts and increases under the domes like the boom of drums or the surge of a hot hive before the swarm flings out. And round the corner of it one almost ran into our inconspicuous and wholly detached private of infantry, his tunic open, his cigarette alight, leaning against some railings and considering the city below. Men in forts and citadels and garrisons all the world over go up at twilight
as automatically as sheep at sundown, to have a last look round. They say little and return as silently across the crunching gravel, detested by bare feet, to their whitewashed rooms and regulated lives. One of the men told me he thought well of Cairo. It was interesting. "Take it from me," he said, "there's a lot in seeing places, because you can remember 'em afterward." He was very right. The purple and lemon-coloured hazes of dusk and reflected day spread over the throbbing, twinkling streets, masked the great outline of the citadel and the desert hills, and conspired to confuse and suggest and evoke memories, till Cairo the sorceress cast her proper shape and danced before me in the heart-breaking likeness of every city I had known and loved a little further up the road. 'Twas a cruel double magic, for in the very hour that my homesick soul had surrendered itself to the dream of the shadow that had turned back upon the dial, I realized all the desolate days and homesickness of all the men penned in far-off places among strange sounds and smells. End of chapter 20. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Egypt of the Magicians, 1913 onwards. Up the River. From Letters of Travel by Rudyard Kipling. Once upon a time there was a murderer who got off with a life sentence. What impressed him most, when he had time to think, was the frank boredom of all who took part in the ritual. It was just like going to a doctor or a dentist, he explained. You come to 'em very full of your affairs, and then you discover it's only part of their daily work to them. I expect, he added, I should have found it the same if I'd gone on to the finish. He would have. Break into any new hell or heaven, and you'll be met at its well-worn threshold by bored experts in attendance. For 3 weeks we sat on copiously chaired and carpeted decks, carefully isolated from everything that had anything to do with Egypt, under the chaperonage of a properly orientalized dragoman. Twice or thrice daily our steamer drew up at a mud bank covered with donkeys. Saddles were hauled out of a hatch in our bows. The donkeys were dressed, dealt round like cards. We rode off through crops or desert, as the case might be, were introduced in ringing tones to a temple, and were then duly returned to our bridge and our Baedekers. For sheer comfort, not to say padded sloth, the life was unequalled, and since the bulk of our passengers were citizens of the United States, Egypt in winter ought to be admitted into the Union as a temporary territory. There was no lack of interest. They were overwhelmingly women, with here and there a placid, nose-led husband or father, visibly suffering from congestion of information about his native city. I had the joy of seeing 2 such men meet. They turned their backs resolutely on the river, bit and lit cigars, and for 1 hour and a quarter ceased not to emit statistics of industries, commerce, manufacture, transport, and journalism of their towns. Los Angeles, let us say, and Rochester, NY. It sounded like a duel between 2 cash registers. One forgot, of course, that all the dreary figures were alive to them, and as Los Angeles spoke, Rochester visualized. Next day I met an Englishman from the Sudan end of things, very full of a little-known railway which had been laid down in what looked like raw desert, and therefore had turned out to be full of paying freight. He was in the full tide of it when Los Angeles ranged alongside and cast anchor, fascinated by the mere roll of numbers. "How's that?" he cut in sharply at a pause. He was told how, and went on to drain my friend dry concerning that railroad, out of sheer fraternal interest, as he explained, in any darn thing that's being made anywheres. So you see, my friend went on, we shall
be bringing Abyssinian cattle into Cairo. On the hoof? One quick glance at the desert ranges. No, by rail and river. And after that, we're going to grow cotton between the Blue and the White Nile and knock spots out of the States. How's that? This way. The speaker spread his first and second fingers fan-wise under the big, interested beak. That's the Blue Nile, and that's the White. There's a difference of so many feet between them, and in that fork here, between my fingers, we shall... I see. Irrigate on the strength of the little difference in the levels. How many acres? Again, Los Angeles was told. He expanded like a frog in a shower. And I thought, he murmured, Egypt was all mummies and the Bible. I used to know something about cotton. Now we'll talk. All that day, the two paced the deck with the absorbed insolente of lovers. And, lover-like, each would steal away and tell me what a splendid soul was his companion. That was one type, but there were others. Professional men who did not make or sell things. And these, the hand of an all-exacting democracy, seemed to have run into one mould. They were not reticent, but, no matter whence they hailed, their talk was as standardized as the fittings of a Pullman. I hinted something of this to a woman aboard who was learned in their sermons of either language. I think, she began, that the staleness you complain of... I never said staleness, I protested. But you thought it. The staleness you noticed is due to our men being so largely educated by old women, old maids. Practically goes to college. And not always then. A boy can't get away from them. Then what happens? The natural result. A man's instinct is to teach a boy to think for himself. If a woman can't make a boy think as she thinks, she sits down and cries. A man hasn't any standards. He makes them. A woman's the most standardized being in the world. She has to be. Now, do you see? Not yet. Well, our trouble in America is that we're being school-marmed to death. You can see it in any paper you pick up. What were those men talking about just now? Food adulteration, police reform, and beautifying waste lots in towns, I replied promptly. She threw up her hands. I knew it, she cried. Our great national policy of co-educational housekeeping. Ham frills and pillow shams. Did you ever know a man get a woman's respect by parading around creation with a dish clout pinned to his coat-tails? But if his woman told him to do it, I suggested. Then she'd despise him the more for doing it. You needn't laugh. You're coming to the same sort of thing in England. I returned to the little gathering. A woman was talking to them as one accustomed to talk from birth. They listened with the rigid attention of men early trained to listen to, but not to talk with, women. She was, to put it mildly, the mother of all she-bores. But when she moved on, no man ventured to say as much. That's what I meant by being school-marmed to death, said my acquaintance wickedly. Why, she bored 'em stiff. But they were so well brought up they didn't even know they were bored. Some day the American man is going to revolt. And what'll the American woman do? She'll sit and cry. And it'll do her good. Later on, I met a woman from a certain western state, seeing God's great, happy, inattentive world for the first time, and rather distressed that it was not like hers. She had always understood that the English were brutal to their wives. The papers of her state said so. If you only knew the papers of her state... But she had not noticed any scandalous treatment so far, and English women, whom she admitted she would never understand, seemed to enjoy a certain specious liberty and equality, while English men were distinctly kind to girls in difficulties over their baggage and tickets on strange railways. And quite a nice people, she concluded, but without much sense of humour. One day she showed me what looked like a fashion paper print of a dress stuff. A pretty oval medallion of stars on a striped grenadine background that somehow seemed familiar. How nice. What is it? I asked. Our national flag, she replied. Indeed, but it doesn't look quite... No, this is a new design for arranging the stars so that they shall be easier to count and more decorative in effect. We're going to take a vote on it in our state, where we have the franchise. I shall cast my vote when I get home. Really? And how will you vote? I'm just thinking that out. She spread the picture on her knee and considered it, head on one side, as though it were indeed dress material. All this while the land of Egypt marched solemnly beside us on either hand. The river being low, we saw it from the boat as one long plinth, 12 to 20 feet high, of brownish purplish mud, visibly upheld every 100 yards or so by glistening copper caryatids in the shape of naked men, bailing water up to the crops above. Behind that bright emerald line ran the fawn or tiger-coloured background of desert, and a pale blue sky closed all. There was Egypt, even as the pharaohs, their engineers and architects had seen it. Land to cultivate, folk and cattle for the work, and outside that work no distraction nor allurement of any kind whatever, save when the dead were taken to their place beyond the limits of cultivation. When the banks grew lower, one looked across as much as 2 miles of green stuff, packed like a toy Noah's Ark with people, camels, sheep, goats, oxen, buffaloes, and an occasional horse. The beasts stood as still, too, as the toys, because they were tethered or hobbled each to his own half-circle of clover, and moved forward when that was eaten. Only the very little kids were loose, and these played on the flat mud roofs like kittens. No wonder every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. The dusty, naked-footed field tracks are cut down to the last centimetre of grudged width. The main roads are lifted high on the flanks of the canals, unless the permanent way of some light railroad can be pressed to do duty for them. The wheat, the pale, ripened, tufted sugar cane, the millet, the barley, the onions, the fringed castor oil bushes jostle each other for foothold, since the desert will not give them room, and men chase the falling Nile inch by inch each dawn with new furrowed melon beds on the still dripping mud banks. Administratively, such land ought to be a joy. The people do not emigrate. All their resources are in plain sight. They are accustomed as their cattle to being led about. All they desire, and it has been given to them, is freedom from murder and mutilation, rape and robbery. The rest they can attend to in their silent, palm-shaded villages, where pigeons coo and the little children play in the dust. But Western civilization is a devastating and a selfish game. Like the young woman from Our State, it says in effect, I am rich. I've nothing to do. I must do something. I shall take up social reform. Just now there is a little social reform in Egypt which is rather amusing. The Egyptian cultivator borrows money, as all farmers must. This land without hedge or wildflower is his passion by age-long inheritance and suffering, by, in, and for which he lives. He borrows to develop it, and to buy more at from £30 to £200 per acre, the profit on which, when it is paid, works out at between £5 to £10 per acre. Formerly, he borrowed from the local moneylenders, mostly Greeks, at 30% per annum and over. This rate is not excessive, so long as public opinion allows the borrower from time to time to slay the lender. But modern administration calls that riot and murder. Some years ago, therefore, there was established a state-guaranteed bank, which lent to cultivators at 8%, and the cultivator zealously availed himself of that privilege. He did not default more than in reason, but, being a farmer, he naturally did not pay up till threatened with being sold up. So he prospered and bought more land, which was his heart's desire. This year, 1913, the administration issued sudden orders that no man owning less than 5 acres could borrow on security of his land. The matter interested me directly, because I have held £500 worth of shares in that state-guaranteed bank, and more than half our clients were small men of less than 5 acres. So I made inquiries in quarters that seemed to possess information, and was told that the new law was precisely on all fours with the Homestead Act or the United States and France, and the intentions of Divine Providence, or words to that effect. But, I asked, won't this limitation of credit prevent the men with less than 5 acres from borrowing more to buy more land and getting on in the world? Yes, was the answer. Of course it will. That's just what we want to prevent. Half these fellows ruin themselves by trying to buy more land. We've got to protect them against themselves. That, alas, is the one enemy against which no law can protect any son of Adam, since the real reasons that make or break a man are too absurd or too obscene to be reached from the outside. Then I cast about in other quarters to discover what the cultivator was going to do about it. "Oh, him," said one of my many informants. "He's all right. There are about 6 ways of evading the Act that I know of. The fellow probably knows another 6. He's been trained to look after himself since the days of Ramesses. He can forge land transfers for one thing, borrow land enough to make his holding more than 5 acres for as long as it takes to register a loan, get money from his own women. Yes, that's one result of modern progress in this land. Or go back to his old friend the Greeks at 30%. Then the Greeks will sell him up, and that will be against the law, won't it?" I said. "Don't you worry about the Greek. He can get through any law ever made if there's 5 piastres on the other side of it." Maybe. But was the Agricultural Bank selling the cultivators up too much? Not in the least. The number of small holdings is on the increase, if anything. Most cultivators won't pay a loan until you point a judgment summons at their head. They think that shows they're men of consequence. This swells the number of judgment summonses issued, but it doesn't mean a land sale for each summons. Another fact is that in real life some men don't get on as well as others. Either they don't farm well enough, or they take to hashish, or they go crazy about a girl and borrow money for her, or something of that kind, and they're sold up. You may have noticed that." "I have. And in the meantime, what is the fellow doing?" "Meantime, the fellow has misread the Act as usual. He thinks it's retrospective, and that he needn't pay past debts. They may make trouble, but I fancy your bank will keep quiet." "Keep quiet? With the bottom knocked out of 2/3 of its business, and my £500 involved?" "Is that your trouble? I don't think your shares will rise in a hurry. But if you want some fun, go and talk to the French about it." This seemed as good a way as any of getting a little interest. The Frenchman that I went to spoke with a certain knowledge of finance and politics, and the natural malice of a logical race against an illogical horde. "Yes," he said, "the idea of limiting credit under these circumstances is absurd. But that is not all. People are not frightened. Business is not upset by one absurd idea, but by the possibilities of more." "Are there more ideas, then, that are going to be tried on in this country?" "2 or 3, he replied placidly. "They are all generous, but they are all ridiculous. Egypt is not a place where one should promulgate ridiculous ideas." "But my shares, my shares!" I cried. "They've already dropped several points." "It is possible they will drop more. Then they will rise." "Thank you, but why?" "Because the idea is fundamentally absurd. That will never be admitted by your people, but there will be arrangements, accommodations, adjustments, till it is all the same as it used to be. It will be the concern of the permanent official, poor devil, to pull it straight. It's always his concern. Meantime, prices will rise for all things." "Why?" "Because the land is the chief security in Egypt. If a man cannot borrow on that security, the rates of interest will increase on whatever other security he offers. That will affect all work and wages and government contracts." He put it so convincingly, and with so many historical illustrations, that I saw whole perspectives of the old energetic pharaohs, masters of life and death along the river, checked in mid-career by cold-blooded accountants, chanting that not even the gods themselves can make 2 + 2 more than 4. And the vision ran down through the ages to one little earnest head on a Cook's steamer, bent sideways over the vital problem of rearranging our national flag so that it should be easier to count the stars. For the 1000th time, praised be Allah for the diversity of His creatures. End of chapter 21. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Egypt of the Magicians, Chapter 5, from Letters of Travel by Rudyard Kipling. Dead Kings. The Swiss are the only people who have taken the trouble to master the art of hotel keeping. Consequently, in things that really matter, beds, bath and victuals, they control Egypt. And since every land always throws back to its aboriginal life, which is why the United States delight in telling aged stories, any ancient Egyptian would at once understand and join in with the life that roars through the nickel-plumbed tourist barracks on the river, where all the world frolics in the sunshine. At first sight, the show lends itself to cheap moralizing, till one records that one only sees busy folk when they are idle, and rich folk when they have made their money. A citizen of the United States, his first trip abroad, pointed out a middle-aged Anglo-Saxon who was relaxing after the manner of several schoolboys. "There's a sample," said the son of hustle scornfully. "Tell me he ever did anything in his life." Unluckily, he had pitched upon one who, when he is in collar, reckons 13½ hours a fairish day's work. Among this assembly were men and women burned to an even blue-black tint, civilized people with bleached hair and sparkling eyes. They explained themselves as diggers, just diggers, and opened me a new world. Granted that all Egypt is one big undertaker's emporium, what could be more fascinating than to get government leave to rummage in a corner of it, to form a little company and spend the cold weather trying to pay dividends in the shape of amethyst necklaces, lapis lazuli scarabs, pots of pure gold and priceless bits of statuary? Or, if one is rich, what better fun than to grubstake an expedition on the supposed site of a dead city and see what turns up? There was a big game hunter who had used most of the continent, quite carried away by this sport. "I'm going to share stakes in a city next year and watch the digging myself," he said. "It beats elephants to pieces. In this game you're digging up dead things and making them alive. Aren't you going to have a flutter?" He showed me a seductive little prospectus. Myself, I would sooner not lay hands on a dead man's kit or equipment, especially when he has gone to his grave in the belief that the trinkets guarantee salvation. Of course, there is the other argument put forward by sceptics that the Egyptian was a blatant self-advertiser, and that nothing would please him more than the thought that he was being looked at and admired after all these years. Still, one might rob some shrinking soul who didn't see it in that light. At the end of spring, the diggers flock back out of the desert and exchange chaff and flues in the gorgeous verandas. For example, A's company has made a find of priceless stuff, heaven knows how old, and is not too meek about it. Company B, less fortunate, hints that if only A knew to what extent their native diggers had been stealing and disposing of the thefts under their very archaeological noses, they would not be so happy. "Nonsense," says Company A. "Our diggers are above suspicion. Besides, we watched 'em." "Are they?" is the reply. "Well, next time you're in Berlin, go to the museum and you'll see what the Germans have got hold of. It must have come out of your ground. The dynasty proves it." So A's cup is poisoned. Till next year. No collector or curator of a museum should have any moral scruples whatever, and I have never met one who had, though I have been informed by deeply shocked informants of 4 nationalities that the Germans are the most flagrant pirates of all. The business of exploration is about as romantic as earthwork on Indian railways. There are the same narrow-gauge trams and donkeys, the same shining gangs in the borrow pits, and the same skirling, dark blue crowds of women and children with the little earth baskets. But the hoes are not driven in, nor the clods jerked aside at random, and when the work fringes along the base of some mighty wall, men use their hands carefully. A white man, or he was white at breakfast time, patrols through the continually renewed dust haze. Weeks may pass without a single bead, but anything may turn up at any moment, and it is his to answer the shout of discovery. We had the good fortune to stay a while at the headquarters of the Metropolitan Museum, New York, in a valley riddled like a rabbit warren with tombs. Their stables, storehouses, and servants' quarters are old tombs. Their talk is of tombs, and their dream, the digger's dream always, is to discover a virgin tomb where the untouched dead lie with their jewels upon them. 4 miles away are the wide-winged, rampant hotels. Here is nothing whatever but the rubbish of death that died thousands of years ago, on whose grave no green thing has ever grown. Villages, expert in 200 generations of grave robbing, cower among the mounds of wastage and whoop at the daily tourist. Paths made by bare feet run from one half-tomb, half-mud heap to the next, not much more distinct than snail smears. But they have been used since. Time is a dangerous thing to play with. That morning the concierge had toiled for us among steamer sailings to see if we could save 3 days. That evening we sat with folk for whom time had stood still since the Ptolemies. I wondered at first how it concerned them or any man if such and such a pharaoh had used to his own glory the plinths and columns of such another pharaoh, before or after Melchizedek. Their whole background was too inconceivably remote for the mind to work on. But the next morning we were taken to the painted tomb of a noble, a minister of agriculture, who died 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. He said to me in so many words, "Observe, I was very like your friend, the late Mr. Samuel Pepys, of your Admiralty. I took an enormous interest in life, which I most thoroughly enjoyed, on its human side and on its spiritual side. I do not think you will find many departments of state better managed than mine, or a better kept house, or a nicer set of young people, my daughters. The eldest, as you can see, takes after her mother. The youngest, my favourite, is supposed to favour me. Now, I will show you all the things that I did and delighted in, till it is time for me to present my accounts elsewhere." And he showed me, detail by detail, in colour and in drawing, his cattle, his horses, his crops, his tours in the district, his accountants presenting the revenue returns, and he himself, busiest of the busy, in a good day. But when we left that broad, gay anteroom and came to the narrower passage where once his body had lain, and where all his doom was portrayed, I could not follow him so well. I did not see how he, so experienced in life, could be cowed by friezes of brute-headed apparitions, or satisfied by files of repeated figures. He explained something to this effect: "We live on the river, a line without breadth or thickness. Behind us is the desert, which nothing can affect, whither no man goes till he is dead. One does not use good agricultural ground for cemeteries. Practically, then, we only move in 2 dimensions, upstream or down. Take away the desert, which we don't consider any more than a healthy man considers death, and you will see that we have no background whatever. Our world is all one straight bar of brown or green earth, and, for some months, mere sky-reflecting water that wipes out everything. You have only to look at the colossi to realize how enormously and extravagantly man and his works must scale in such a country. Remember, too, that our crops are sure and our life is very, very easy. Above all, we have no neighbours. That is to say, we must give out, for we cannot take in. Now I put it to you, what is left for a priest with imagination, except to develop ritual and multiply gods on friezes? Unlimited leisure, limited space of 2 dimensions, divided by the hypnotizing line of the river and bounded by visible, unalterable death, must ipso facto—" "Even so," I interrupted, "I do not comprehend your gods. Your direct worship of beasts, for instance. You prefer the indirect, the worship of humanity with a capital H. My gods, or what I saw in them, contented me." What do you see in your gods as affecting belief and conduct? You know the answer to the riddle of the Sphinx?
No, I murmured. What is it?
All sensible men are of the same religion, but no sensible man ever tells, he replied. With that I had to be content, for the passage ended in solid rock. There were other tombs in the valley, but the owners were dumb, except one pharaoh, who, from the highest motives, had broken with the creeds and instincts of his country, and so had all but wrecked it. One of his discoveries was an artist, who saw men not on one plane, but modelled full or three-quarter face, with limbs suited to their loads and postures. His vividly realised stuff leapt to the eye out of the acreage of low relief in the old convention, and I applauded as a properly brought-up tourist should. Mine was a fatal mistake. Pharaoh Akhenaten sighed in my ear. I mistook the conventions of life for the realities. Ah, those soul-crippling conventions, I cried. You mistake me, he answered more stiffly. I was so sure of their reality that I thought they were really lies, whereas they were only invented to cover the raw facts of life. Ah, those raw facts of life, I cried still louder, for it is not often that one has a chance of impressing a pharaoh. We must face them with open eyes and an open mind. Did you? I had no opportunity of avoiding them, he replied. I broke every convention in my land. Oh, noble! And what happened? What happens when you strip the cover off a hornet's nest? The raw fact of life is that mankind is just a little lower than the angels, and the conventions are based on that fact in order that men may become angels. But if you begin as I did by the convention that men are angels, they will assuredly become bigger beasts than ever. That, I said firmly, is altogether out of date. You should have brought a larger mentality, a more vital uplift, and, all that sort of thing, to bear on. All that sort of thing, you know. I did, said Akhenaten gloomily. It broke me. And he, too, went dumb among the ruins. There is a valley of rocks and stones in every shade of red and brown, called the Valley of the Kings, where a little oil engine coughs behind its hand all day long, grinding electricity to light the faces of dead pharaohs 100 feet underground. All down the valley during the tourist season stand charabancs and donkeys and sand carts, with here and there exhausted couples who have dropped out of the processions and glisten and fan themselves in some scrap of shade. Along the sides of the valley are the tombs of the kings, neatly numbered, as it might be mining adits, with concrete steps leading up to them, and iron grills that lock of nights, and doorkeepers of the Department of Antiquities demanding the proper tickets. One enters, and from deeps below deeps hears the voices of dragomans booming through the names and titles of the illustrious and thrice puissant dead. Rock-cut steps go down into hot, still darkness. Passages twist and are led over blind pits, which men say the wise builders childishly hoped would be taken for the real tombs by thieves to come. Up and down these alleyways clatter all the races of Europe, with a strong backing of the United States. Their footsteps are suddenly blunted on the floor of a hall paved with immemorial dust that will never dance in any wind. They peer up at the blazoned ceilings, stoop down to the minutely decorated walls, crane and follow the sombre splendours of a cornice, draw in their breaths and climb up again to the fierce sunshine to re-dive into the next adit on their programme. What they think proper to say, they say aloud, and some of it is very interesting. What they feel you can guess from a certain haste in their movements, something between the shrinking modesty of a man under fire and the hadn't we better be getting on attitude of visitors to a mine. After all, it is not natural for man to go underground except for business, and for the last time. He is conscious of the weight of Mother Earth overhead, and when to her expectant bulk is added the whole beaked, horned, winged and crowned hierarchy of a lost faith flaming at every turn of his eye,
he naturally wishes to move away. Even the sight of a very great king indeed, sarcophagused under electric light in a hall full of most fortifying pictures, does not hold him too long. Some men assert that the crypt of St. Peter's, with only 19 centuries bearing down on the groining, and the tombs of early popes and kings all about, is more impressive than the Valley of the Kings, because it explains how and out of what an existing creed grew. But the Valley of the Kings explains nothing, except that most terrible line in Macbeth: to the last syllable of recorded time. Earth opens her dry lips and says it. In one of the tombs there is a little chamber whose ceiling, probably because of a fault in the rock, could not be smoothed off like the others. So the decorator very cunningly covered it with a closely designed cloth pattern, just a chintz-like piece of stuff, as in real life one would use to underhang a rough roof with. He did it perfectly down there in the dark, and went his way. Thousands of years later there was born a man of my acquaintance who, for good and sufficient reason, had an almost insane horror of anything in the nature of a ceiling cloth. He used to make excuses for not going into the dry goods shops at Christmas, when hastily enlarged annexes are hidden, roof and sides, with embroideries. Perhaps a snake or a lizard had dropped on his mother from the roof before he was born. Perhaps it was the memory of some hideous fever bout in a tent. At any rate, that man's idea of the torment was a hot, crowded underground room underhung with patterned cloths. Once in his life, at a city in the far north, where he had to make a speech, he met that perfect combination. They led him up and down narrow, crowded, steam-heated passages, till they planted him at last in a room without visible windows, by which he knew he was underground, and directly beneath a warm, patterned ceiling cloth, rather like a tent lining. And there he had to say his say, while panic terror sat in his throat. The second time was in the Valley of the Kings, where very similar passages, crowded with people, led him to a room cut of rock, fathoms underground, with what looked like a sagging chintz cloth not 3 feet above his head. "The man I'd like to catch," he said, when he came outside again, "is that decorator man. Do you suppose he meant to produce that effect?" Every man has his private terrors, other than those of his own conscience. From what I saw in the Valley of the Kings, the Egyptians seem to have known this some time ago. They certainly have impressed it on most unexpected people. I heard 2 voices down a passage talking together as follows. She: "I guess we weren't ever meant to see these tombs from inside, anyway." He: "How so?" She: "For one thing, they believe so hard in being dead. Of course, their outlook on spiritual things wasn't as broad as ours." He: "Well, there's no danger of our being led away by it. Did you buy that alleged scarab off the dragoman this morning?" End of chapter 22. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Egypt of the Magicians. The Face of the Desert. From Letters of Travel by Rudyard Kipling. Going up the Nile is like running the gauntlet before eternity. Till one has seen it, one does not realize the amazing thinness of that little damp trickle of life that steals along undefeated through the jaws of established death. A rifle shot would cover the widest limits of cultivation. A bow shot would reach the narrower. Once beyond them, a man may carry his next drink with him until he reaches Cape Blanco on the west, where he may signal for one from the passing Guinean castle boat, or the Karachi Club on the east, say 4,000 dry miles to the left hand and 3,000 to the right. The way to the desert is on one every day and every hour. At morning, when the cavalcade tramps along the rear of the tulip-like dragoman, she says, "I'm here," just beyond that ridge of pink sand that you're admiring. Come along, pretty gentleman, and I'll tell you your fortune." But the dragoman says very clearly, "Please, sir, do not separate yourself at all from the main body," which the Desert knows well you had no thought of doing. At noon, when the stewards rummage out lunch drinks from the dewy ice chest, the Desert whines louder than the well wheels on the bank. "I'm here, only a quarter of a mile away. For mercy's sake, pretty gentleman, spare a mouthful of that prickly whiskey and soda you are lifting to your lips. There's a white man a few hundred miles off dying on my lap of thirst that you cure with a rag dipped in lukewarm water. While you hold him down with the one hand, he thinks he is cursing you aloud, but he isn't, because his tongue is outside his mouth and he can't get it back. Thank you, my noble captain." For naturally one tips half the drink over the rail with the ancient prayer, "May it reach him who needs it," and turns one's back on the pulsing ridges and fluid horizons that are beginning their midday mirage dance. At evening the Desert obtrudes again, tricked out as a Nautch girl in veils of purple, saffron, gold tinsel, and grass green. She postures shamelessly before the delighted tourists with woven skeins of homeward flying pelicans, fringes of wild duck, black spotted on crimson, and cheap jewellery of opal clouds. "Notice me," she cries like any other worthless woman. "Admire the play of my mobile features, the revelations of my multicoloured soul. Observe my allurements and potentialities. Thrill while I stir you." So she floats through all her changes and retires upstage into the arms of the dusk. But at midnight she drops all pretence and bears down in her natural shape, which depends upon the conscience of the beholder and his distance from the next white man. You will observe in the Benedicite Omnia opera that the Desert is the sole thing not enjoined to bless the Lord, praise him, and magnify him forever. This is because when our illustrious father, the Lord Adam, and his august consort, the Lady Eve, were expelled from Eden, Eblis the accursed, fearful lest mankind should return ultimately to the favour of Allah, set himself to burn and lay waste all the lands east and west of Eden. Oddly enough, the Garden of Eden is almost the exact centre of all the world's deserts, counting from Gobi to Timbuktu, and all that land, qua land, is dismissed from the mercy of God. Those who use it do so at their own risk. Consequently, the Desert produces her own type of man exactly as the sea does. I was fortunate enough to meet one sample, aged perhaps 25. His work took him along the edge of the Red Sea, where men on swift camels come to smuggle hashish, and sometimes guns, from dhows that put in to any convenient beach. These smugglers must be chased on still swifter camels, and, since the wells are few and known, the game is to get ahead of them and occupy their drinking places. But they may skip a well or so, and do several days' march in one. Then their pursuer must take e'en greater risks, and make crueller marches that the law may be upheld. The one thing in the law's favour is that hashish smells abominably, worse than a heated camel. So, when they range alongside, no time is lost in listening to lies. It was not told to me how they navigate themselves across the broken wastes, or by what arts they keep alive in the dust storms and heat. That was taken for granted, and the man who took it so considered himself the most commonplace of mortals. He was deeply moved by the account of a new aerial route which the French are laying out somewhere in the Sahara, over a waterless stretch of 400 miles, where if the aeroplane is disabled between stations, the pilot will most likely die and dry up beside it. To do the Desert justice, she rarely bothers to wipe out evidence of a kill. There are places in the Desert, men say, where even now you come across the dead of old battles, as light as last year's wasps' nests, laid down in swathes or strung out in flight, with, here and there, the little sparkling lines of the emptied cartridge cases that dropped them. There are valleys and ravines that the craziest smugglers do not care to refuge in at certain times of the year, as there are rest houses where one's native servants will not stay because they are challenged on their way to the kitchen by sentries of old Sudanese regiments which have long gone over to paradise, and of voices and warnings and outcries behind rocks there is no end. These last arise from the fact that men very rarely live in a spot so utterly still that they can hear the murmuring race of the blood over their own eardrums. Neither ship, prairie, nor forest gives that silence. I went out to find it once, when our steamer tied up and the rest of them had gone to see a sight, but I never dared venture more than a mile from our funnel smoke. At that point I came upon a hill honeycombed with graves that held a multitude of paper-white skulls, all grinning cheerfully like ambassadors of the desert. But I did not accept their invitation. They had told me that all the little devils learn to draw in the desert, which explains the elaborate and purposeless detail that fills it. None but devils could think of etching every rock outcrop with wind lines, or skinning it down to its glistening nerves with sand blasts, of arranging hills in the likeness of pyramids and sphinxes and wrecked town suburbs, of covering the space of half an English county with sepia studies of interlacing and recrossing ravines, dongas and nullahs, each an exposition of much too clever perspective, and of wiping out the half-finished work with a wash of sand in 3 tints, only to pick it up again in silver point on the horizon's edge. This they do in order to make lost travellers think they can recognize landmarks and run about identifying them till the madness comes. The desert is all devil device, as you might say, blasted cleverness, crammed with futile works, always promising something fresh round the next corner, always leading out through heaped decoration and over-insistent design into equal barrenness. There was a morning of mornings when we lay opposite the rock-hewn temple of Abu Simbel, where 4 great figures, each 60 feet high, sit with their hands on their knees waiting for Judgment Day. At their feet is a little breadth of blue-green crop. They seem to hold back all the weight of the desert behind them, which, none the less, lips over at one side in a cataract of vividest orange sand. The tourist is recommended to see the sunrise here, either from within the temple, where it falls on a certain altar erected by Rameses in his own honour, or from without, where another power takes charge. The stars had paled when we began our watch. The river birds were just whispering over their toilette in the uncertain purplish light. Then the river dimmered up like pewter. The line of the ridge behind the temple showed itself against a milkiness in the sky. One felt rather than saw that there were 4 figures in the pit of gloom below it. These blocked themselves out, huge enough, but without any special terror, while the glorious ritual of the eastern dawn went forward. Some reed of the bank revealed itself by reflection, black on silver. Arched wings flapped and jarred the still water to splintered glass. The desert ridge turned to topaz, and the 4 figures stood clear, yet without shadowing, from their background. The stronger light flooded them, red from head to foot, and they became alive, as horridly and tensely yet blindly alive as pinioned men in the death chair before the current is switched on. One felt that if by any miracle the dawn could be delayed a second longer, they would tear themselves free and leap forth to heaven knows what sort of vengeance. But that instant the full sun pinned them in their places, nothing more than statues, slashed with light and shadow, and another day got to work. A few yards to the left of the great images, close to the statue of an Egyptian princess, whose face the very face of She, there was a marble slab over the grave of an English officer killed in a fight against the dervishes nearly a generation ago. From Abu Simbel to Wadi Halfa, the river
escaped from the domination of the Pharaohs, begins to talk about dead white men. 30 years ago, young English officers in India lied and intrigued furiously that they might be attached to expeditions whose bases were sometimes in Suakim, sometimes quite in the desert air, but all of whose deeds are now quite forgotten. Occasionally, the dragoman, waving a smooth hand east or southeasterly, will speak of some fight. Then everyone murmurs, "Oh, yes, that was Gordon, of course," or "Was that before or after Omdurman?" But the river is much more precise. As the boat quarters the falling stream like a puzzled hound, all the old names spurt up again under the paddle wheels. Hicks Army, Val Baker, El Teb, Toka, Tamai, Tamanyeb, and Osman Dinga. Her head swings round for another slant. "We cannot land English or Indian troops. If consulted, recommend abandonment of the Sudan within certain limits." That was my Lord Granville chirruping to the advisers of His Highness the Khedive, and the sentence comes back as crisp as when it first shocked one in '84. Next, there is a long reach between flooded palm trees. Next, of course, comes Gordon and a delightfully mad Irish war correspondent who was locked up with him in Khartoum. Gordon, '84. '85, the Suakim Berber Railway, really begun and quite as really abandoned. Korti, Abu Klea, the Desert Column, a steamer called the Safieh, not the Condor, which rescued 2 other steamers wrecked on their way back from a Khartoum in the red hands of the Mahdi of those days. Then the smooth glide over the deep water continues. Another Suakim expedition, with a great deal of Osman Dinga and renewed attempts to build the Suakim Berber Railway. Hashin, say the paddle wheels, slowing all of a sudden. MacNeill's Zareba, the 15th Sikhs, and another native regiment. Osman Dinga in great pride and power, and Wadi Halfa, a frontier town. Tamai once more, another siege of Suakim. Gemaiza, Handab, Trinkitat, and Toka, 1887. The river recalls the names. The mind at once brings up the face and every trick of speech of some youth met for a few hours maybe in a train on the way to Egypt of the old days. Both name and face utterly vanished from one's memory till then. It was another generation that picked up the ball 10 years later and touched down in Khartoum. Several people aboard the Cook boat had been to that city. They all agreed that the hotel charges were very high, but that you could buy the most delightful curiosities in the native bazaar. But I do not like bazaars of the Egyptian kind, since a discovery I made at Aswan. There was an old man, a Mussulman, who pressed me to buy some truck or other, but not with the villainous camaraderie that generations of low-caste tourists have taught the people, nor yet with the cosmopolitan light-handedness of appeal which the town-bred Egyptian picks up much too quickly, but with a certain desperate zeal foreign to his whole creed and nature. He fingered, he implored, he fawned with an unsteady eye, and while I wondered, I saw behind him the puffy pink face of a Fez Jew, watching him as a stoat watches a rabbit. When he moved, the Jew followed and took position at a commanding angle. The old man glanced from me to him and renewed his solicitations. So one could imagine an elderly hare thumping wildly on a tambourine with the stoat behind him. They told me afterwards that Jews own most of the stalls in the Aswan Bazaar, the Mussulmans working for them, since tourists need Oriental colour. Never having seen or imagined a Jew coercing a Mussulman, this colour was new and displeasing to me. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Egypt of the Magicians. The Riddle of Empire.
From Letters of Travel by Rudyard Kipling. At Halfa, one feels the first breath of a frontier. Here the Egyptian government retires into the background, and even the Cook steamer does not draw up in the exact centre of the postcard. At the telegraph office, too, there are traces, diluted but quite recognisable, of military administration. Nor does the town, in any way or place whatever, smell, which is proof that it is not looked after on popular lines. There is nothing to see in it any more than there is in Hulk C-60, late of Her Majesty's troopship Himalaya, now a coal hulk in the Hamoaze at Plymouth. A riverfront, a narrow terraced river walk of semi-oriental houses, barracks, a mosque, and half a dozen streets at right angles, the desert racing up to the end of each, make all the town. A mile or so upstream, under palm trees, are bungalows of what must have been cantonments, some machinery repair shops, and odds and ends of railway track. It's all as paltry a collection of whitewashed houses, pitiful gardens, dead walls, and trodden waste spaces as one would wish to find anywhere, and every bit of it quivers with the remembered life of armies and river fleets, as the finger bowl rings when the rubbing finger is lifted. Most unlikely men have done time there. Stores by the 1,000-ton have been rolled and pushed and hauled up the banks by tens of thousands of scattered hands. Hospitals have pitched themselves there, expanded enormously, shrivelled up and drifted away with the drifting regiments. Railway sidings by the mile have been laid down and ripped up again as need changed, and utterly wiped out by the sands. Halfa has been the railhead, army headquarters, and hub of the universe, the one place where a man could make sure of buying tobacco and sardines, and could hope for letters for himself and medical attendance for his friend. Now she is a little shrunken shell of a town, without a proper hotel, where tourists hurry up from the river to buy complete sets of Sudan stamps at the post office. I went for a purposeless walk from one end of the place to the other, and found a crowd of native boys playing football on what might have been a parade ground of the old days. "And what school is that?" I asked in English of a small, eager youth. "Madrisha," said he most intelligently, which, being translated, means just school. "Yes, but what school?" "Yes, Madrisha, school, sir." And he tagged after to see what else the imbecile wanted. A line of railway track that must have bed big workshops in its time led me between big-roomed houses and offices labelled departmentally, with here and there a clerk at work. I was directed and redirected by polite Egyptian officials. I wished to get at a white officer if possible, but there wasn't one about. Was turned out of a garden which belonged to an authority, hung round the gate of a bungalow with an old established compound and two white men sitting in chairs on a veranda, wandered down towards the river, under the palm trees, where the last red light came through, lost myself among rusty boilers and balks of timber, and at last loafed back in the twilight, escorted by the small boy and an entire brigade of ghosts, not one of whom I had ever met before, but all of whom I knew most intimately. They said it was the evenings that used to depress them most, too. So all came back after dinner and bore me company, while I went to meet a friend arriving by the night train from Khartoum. She was an hour late, and we spent it, the ghosts and I, in a brick-walled, tin-roofed shed, warm with the day's heat, a crowd of natives laughing and talking somewhere behind in the darkness. We knew each other so well by that time that we'd finished discussing every conceivable topic of conversation, the whereabouts of the Mahdi's head, for instance, work, reward, despair, acknowledgement, flat failure, all the real motives that had driven us to do anything, and all our other longings. So we sat still and let the stars move, as men must do when they meet this kind of train. Presently I asked, "What's the name of the next station out from here?" "Station number 1, said a ghost. "And the next?" "Station number 2, and so on to 8, I think." And wasn't it worth while to name even one of these stations for some man, living or dead, who had something to do with making the line? "Well, they didn't anyhow," said another ghost. "I suppose they didn't think it worth while."
Why, what do you think?
I think, I replied, it is the sort of snobbery that nations go to Hades for. Her headlights showed at last, an immense distance off. The economic electrics were turned up, the ghosts vanished, the dragomans of the various steamers flowed forward in beautiful garments to meet their passengers who had booked passages in the Cook boats, and the Khartoum train decanted a joyous collection of folk, all decorated with horns, hoofs, skins, hides, knives, and assegais, which they had been buying at Omdurman. And when the porters laid hold upon their bustling bundles, it was like MacNeill's Zareba, without the camels. 2 young men in tarbouche were the only people who had no part in the riot. Said one of them to the other, "Hello." Said the other, "Hello." They grunted together for a while. Then one pleasantly, "Oh, I'm sorry for that. I thought I was going to have you under me for a bit." "Then you'll use the rest house there?" "I suppose so," said the other. "Do you happen to know if the roof's on?" Here a woman wailed aloud for her dervish spear which had gone adrift, and I shall never know, except from the back pages of the Sudan Almanac, what state that rest house there is in. The Sudan administration, by the little I heard, is a queer service. It extends itself in silence from the edges of Abyssinia to the swamps of the equator, at an average pressure of one white man to several thousand square miles. It legislates according to the custom of the tribe where possible, and on the common sense of the moment when there is no precedent. It is recruited almost wholly from the army, armed chiefly with binoculars, and enjoys a death rate a little lower than its own reputation. It is said to be the only service in which a man taking his leave is explicitly recommended to get out of the country and rest himself that he may return the more fit for his job. A high standard of intelligence is required, and lapses are not overlooked. For instance, one man on leave in London took the wrong train from Boulogne, and instead of going to Paris, which of course he had intended, he found himself at a station called Kilici, or Adrianople West, where he stayed for some weeks. It was a mistake that might have happened to anyone on a dark night after a stormy passage, but the authorities would not believe it, and when I left Egypt were busily engaged in boiling him in hot oil. They are grossly respectable in the Sudan now. Long and long ago, even before the Philippines were taken, a friend of mine was reprimanded by a British Member of Parliament for the sin of blood guiltiness because he was by trade a soldier. Next, for murder because he had fought in great battles, and lastly and most important, because he and his fellow braves had saddled the British taxpayer with the expense of the Sudan. My friend explained that all the Sudan had ever cost the British taxpayer was the price of about 12 regulation Union Jacks, one for each province. "That," said the MP triumphantly, "is all it will ever be worth." He went on to justify himself, and the Sudan went on also. Today it has taken its place as one of those accepted miracles which are worked without heat or headlines by men who do the job nearest their hand and seldom fuss about their reputations. But less than 16 years ago, the length and breadth of it was one crazy hell of murder, torture, and lust, where every man who had a sword used it till he met a stronger and became a slave. It was, men say who remember it, a hysteria of blood and fanaticism, and precisely as a hysterical woman is called to her senses by a dash of cold water, so at the Battle of Omdurman the land was reduced to sanity by applied death on such a scale as the murderers and the torturers at their most unbridled could scarcely have dreamed. In a day and a night all who had power and authority were wiped out and put under till, as the old song says. No chief remained to ask after any follower. They had all charged into paradise. The people who were left looked for renewed massacres of the sort they had been accustomed to, and when these did not come, they said helplessly, "We have nothing, we have nothing. Will you sell us into slavery among the Egyptians?" The men who remember the old days of the Reconstruction, which deserves an epic of its own, say that there was nothing left to build on, not even wreckage. Knowledge, decency, kinship, property, tide, sense of possession had all gone. The people were told they were to sit still and obey orders, and they stared and fumbled like dazed crowds after an explosion. Bit by bit, however, they were fed and watered and marshalled into some sort of order, set to tasks they never dreamed to see the end of, and, almost by physical force, pushed and hauled along the ways of mere life. They came to understand presently that they might reap what they had sown, and that a man, even a woman, might walk for a day's journey with 2 goats and a native bedstead and live undespoiled. But they had to be taught kindergarten fashion. And little by little they realized that the new order was sure, and that their ancient oppressors were quite dead. There returned not only cultivators, craftsmen and artisans, but outlandish men of war, scarred with old wounds and the generous dimples that the Martini Henry bullet used to heal. Fighting men on the lookout for new employ. They would hang about, first on one leg, then on the other, proud or uneasily friendly, till some white officer circulated nearby. And at his 4th or 5th passing, brown and white having approved each other by eye, the talk, so men say, would run something like this: Officer, with air of sudden discovery: "Oh, you by the hut there, what's your business?" Warrior, at attention complicated by attempt to salute: "I am so and so, son of so and so, from such and such a place." Officer: "I hear, and—" Warrior, repeating salute: "And a fighting man also." Officer, impersonally to the horizon: "But they all say that nowadays." Warrior, very loudly: "But there is a man in one of your battalions who can testify to it. He is the grandson of my father's uncle." Officer, confidentially to his boots: "Hell is quite full of such grandsons of such fathers' uncles, and how do I know if Private So-and-so speaks the truth about his family?" Makes to go. Warrior, swiftly removing necessary garments: "Perhaps, but these don't lie. Look, I got this 10-12 years ago when I was quite a lad, close to the old border. Yes, Halfa. It was a true Snider bullet. Feel it. This little one on the leg I got at the big fight that finished it all last year. But I am not lame." Violent leg exercise: "Not in the least lame. See, I run, I jump, I kick. Praise be Allah." Officer: "Praise be Allah. And then?" Warrior, coquettishly: "Then I shoot. I am not common spearman." Lapse into English: "Yeah, damn good shot." Pumps lever of imaginary martini. Officer, unmoved: "I see. And then?" Warrior, indignantly: "I am come here after many days marching." Changed childlike wheedle: "Are all the regiments full?" At this point the relative in uniform generally discovered himself, and if the officer liked the cut of his jib, another old Mahdi's man would be added to the machine that made itself as it rolled along. They dealt with situations in those days by the unclouded light of reason and a certain high and holy audacity. There is a tale of 2 sheikhs shortly after the reconstruction began. One of them, Abdullah of the River, prudent and the son of a slave woman, professed loyalty to the English very early in the day, and used that loyalty as a cloak to lift camels from another sheikh, Farid of the Desert, still at war with the English, but a perfect gentleman, which Abdullah was not. Naturally, Farid raided back on Abdullah's kine. Abdullah complained to the authorities, and the border fermented. To Farid in his desert camp, with a clutch of Abdullah's cattle round him, entered alone and unarmed the officer responsible for the peace of those parts. After compliments, for they had had dealings with each other before: "You've been driving Abdullah's stock again," said the Englishman. "I should think I had," was the hot answer. "He lifts my camels and scuttles back into your territory, where he knows I can't follow him for the life. And when I try to get my own back, he whines to you. He's a cad, an utter cad. At any rate, he's loyal. If you'd only come in and be loyal too, you'd both be on the same footing, and then if he stole from you, he'd catch it. He'd never dare to steal except under your protection. Give him what he'd have got in the Mahdi's time, a first-class flogging. You know he deserves it." "I'm afraid that isn't allowed. You'll have to let me shift all those bullocks of his back again." "And if I don't?"
Then I shall have to ride back and collect all my men and begin war against you. But what prevents my cutting your throat where you sit? For one thing, you aren't Abdullah, and there, you confess he's a cad. And for another, the government would only send another officer who didn't understand your ways, and then there would be war, and no one would score except Abdullah. He'd steal your camels and get credit for it. So he would, the scoundrel. This is a hard word for honest men. Now, you admit Abdullah is a cad. Listen to me, and I'll tell you a few more things about him. He was, etc., etc. He is, etc., etc. You're perfectly right, Sheikh, but don't you see, I can't tell him what I think of him so long as he's loyal and you're against us. Now, if you come in, I promise you that I'll give Abdullah a telling off, yes, in your presence, that will do you good to listen to. No, I won't come in, but I tell you what I'll do. I'll accompany you tomorrow as your guest, understand, to your camp. Then you send for Abdullah, and if I judge that his fat face has been sufficiently blackened in my presence, I'll think about coming in later. So it was arranged, and they slept out the rest of the night, side by side. And in the morning they gathered up and returned all Abdullah's cattle, and in the evening, in Farid's presence, Abdullah got the tongue-lashing of his wicked old life, and Farid of the desert laughed and came in, and they all lived happy ever afterwards. Somewhere or other in the nearer provinces, the old heady game must be going on still, but the Sudan proper has been settled to civilization of the brick bungalow and bougainvillea sort, and there is a huge technical college where the young men are trained to become fitters, surveyors, draftsmen, and telegraph employees at fabulous wages. In due time they will forget how warily their fathers had to walk in the Mahdi's time to secure even half a bellyful. Then, as has happened elsewhere, they will honestly believe that they themselves originally created and since then have upheld the easy life into which they were bought at so heavy a price. Then the demand will go up for extension of local government, Sudan for the Sudanese, and so on, till the whole cycle has to be retrodden. It is a hard law, but an old one. Rome died learning it, as our Western civilization may die, that if you give any man anything he has not painfully earned for himself, you infallibly make him or his descendants your devoted enemies. The End. End of The Riddle of Empire. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. End of Letters of Travel by Rudyard Kipling.